What if the greatest power shift in Renaissance Europe happened not on a battlefield, not in a throne room, but quietly, in leather-bound ledgers, in the careful notation of debits and credits, in the patient accumulation of florins across decades? What if the real conquest of Rome came not with swords but with bankers' seals? And what if the men who came to wear the papal tiara first learned to count before they learned to pray? This is the story of how finance reshaped faith itself, how a family of merchants transformed into princes of the church, and how the logic of the counting house came to govern the logic of salvation. And if you're drawn to the hidden architectures of history, the way wealth and power move like underground rivers beneath the surface of great events, you might find something in this journey through centuries of quiet ambition and gilded intrigue worth returning to again and again. I invite you to subscribe so that whenever you need to drift through these forgotten corridors of power where the Medici popes once walked, you can find your way back. But let us begin in the place where it all started. Let us begin in Florence, in that hour just before dawn when the city is most itself. The Arno moves through Florence like a long, soft breath. In these early hours, when the first light is still more promise than presence, when the sky above the city holds that particular grey of stone and sleep, the river seems to carry the morning mist as though it were something precious, something that must be delivered carefully downstream toward Pisa and the waiting sea. Stand on any of the old bridges, the Ponte Vecchio with its shops of goldsmiths and jewelers, or one of the older crossings, and you will feel the dampness in the air, that cool settling of moisture that clings to your skin and softens every sound. The cathedral bells have not yet rung. That is the peculiar piece of this hour. The great dome of the Duomo, that impossible feat of engineering designed by Brunelleschi, rises above the rooftops, like something only half emerged from sleep itself. Its terracotta tiles, red as dried blood or as wine, are barely visible in the dimness. But you know it is there. You know its weight, its permanence, its absolute certainty in the sky. Every Florentine knows the cathedral the way one knows one's own heartbeat, through presence rather than through sight. The stone streets are narrow here, narrower than a modern mind might expect. Medieval Florence was built for feet and for horses, not for the sweeping vistas of the streets that would come later. The buildings lean toward one another across these passages as though they were gossiping, as though they were sharing secrets that had accumulated over the centuries. Their stone faces are weathered, marked with centuries of water, weather, the soft erasure that time performs on human craft. Some of the walls show the ancient arrangement of rustication, that particular Florentine style in which blocks of stone are laid deliberately rough and massive, a kind of architectural statement that says, "We are built to last, we will not crumble, we are the foundation of permanence itself." But Florence in these early hours feels vulnerable in a way that the stones themselves do not. The darkness still holds dominion over the streets. The few people who are awake, bakers heading toward their ovens, merchants preparing their stalls, servants carrying water, move through the fog like figures in a half-remembered dream. They know these streets so intimately that they need not see them. Their feet find the correct turns through something closer to instinct than to navigation. The mist, though, the mist rises from the Arno and from the lower-lying areas of the city and transforms Florence into something less than solid. The edges of buildings soften. The distances become uncertain. Is that corner 50 paces away or 100? The normal geometry of the waking city dissolves into something older, something that might have existed 500 years ago, or 1,000, something that belongs less to the orderly world of merchants and accounts than to the older Florence of storytellers and dreamers. And yet, even in this transformed and uncertain hour, even in this mist that makes the city feel dreamlike and unbounded, there is something that distinguishes Florence from every other city in Christendom. There is a quality of intention in the arrangement of streets, in the placement of buildings, in the way the city is organized. Even in darkness and fog, you sense the hand of human will, human ambition, human certainty imposed upon the landscape. The cathedral asserts itself not through mere size, but through architectural confidence. The buildings cluster around their piazzas with a kind of conscious geometry, a sense of space calculated and controlled. This is the Florence of the 15th century, in the time when the Medici were still rising, still building their power, still learning how to transform the logic of commerce into the logic of rule. This is a city of contradictions, deeply religious and shrewdly mercenary, devoted to art and to money, dreaming of beauty while scheming toward power. The mist that hangs over the Arno in these early hours contains all of this confusion, all of this ambition, all of this careful and determined transformation of a place into something greater than itself. And as the dawn begins, so slowly, so gradually that you cannot quite say when the darkness actually ends and the light begins, as the first actual illumination touches the edges of the stones, as the cathedral dome becomes more visible, as the fog begins its slow lifting upward into the already brightening sky, you can imagine the merchants stirring in their homes and their counting houses. You can imagine the ledgers being opened, the ink being prepared, the careful documentation of commerce beginning its daily work. You can imagine the money changers thinking about the day ahead, the loans that must be managed, the accounts that must be balanced, the intricate choreography of finance that moves beneath the surface of the city like the Arno beneath its bridges. For in Florence, even in this early hour, when other cities might still be lost entirely in sleep, the work of money never truly stops. The work of power, dressed in the language of commerce and ledgers, never fully rests. And it is from this world, from these streets still half-wreathed in mist, from these counting houses and family palaces, from this particular constellation of ambition, faith, and financial acumen, that a family will rise to reshape the very church itself, to make themselves the voice of Rome, to transform not just Florence, but all of Christendom through the quiet power of the ledger and the coin. This is where our story begins, in these misty hours before the full day breaks, in the Florence that belongs neither fully to the night nor yet to the waking world, in the moment when a city is most itself, still dreaming, but already calculating, already at work on its own transformation. The story we're about to unfold reaches into centuries where power didn't always announce itself with trumpets or armies, but whispered instead through ledgers and silk-lined corridors, through the careful placement of a cardinal here, a confession heard there, a loan extended with the gentlest of conditions. This is the story of the Medici popes, those moments when banking dynasties and divine authority merged so completely that you could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. And it's a story that reminds us how quietly the world's greatest shifts in power often occur. If you find yourself drawn to these hidden turning points in history, those moments when wealth, faith, and ambition intersected in ways that few people notice but everyone eventually feels, I'd invite you to subscribe so you don't miss future journeys into the forgotten corners of our shared past. These are the stories that rarely make it into morning documentaries, the ones best saved for late hours when the mind is calm enough to absorb their full complexity without rush or distraction. Each episode follows this same gentle rhythm, moving slowly through the texture of how power really works, beneath the surface of what we think we know. The Medici story in particular is one that rewards this kind of patient, unhurried attention, because it's not primarily a story of violence or dramatic reversals, though those elements certainly appear. It's fundamentally a story about influence, about how a family from a small Italian city learned to speak the language that mattered most in their world, not the language of swords, but of money. And money, as you'll discover in the hours ahead, proved far more eloquent than any battlefield. What's remarkable about the Medici rise is that it happened so gradually that the traditional powers of Europe barely noticed it happening at all. Kings and emperors, cardinals and bishops went about their business of ruling and blessing, collecting taxes and dispensing sacraments, while in Florence, a family of cloth merchants gradually transformed themselves into something far more subtle and ultimately far more powerful: the bankers who held Europe's wealth in their vaults. They didn't conquer territories, they financed the conquest of others and took their commission quietly. They didn't declare themselves rulers, they elected someone else ruler and whispered suggestions into their ear. And when their ambitions turned toward the church itself, toward the seat of St. Peter itself, they deployed these same weapons of patience, wealth, and political calculation. This is a story that unfolds across nearly 3 centuries, beginning in earnest in the early 1400s and extending well beyond the Reformation that shook Christianity to its foundations. It's a story populated with remarkable people, some brilliant, some ruthless, some genuinely trying to reconcile the weight of spiritual authority with the weight of human greed. It's a story written in the margins of famous events, in the spaces between what historians usually emphasize, and it's a story that asks us to think carefully about the relationship between money and power, between the sacred and the practical, questions that remain startlingly relevant even now, centuries later, in a world that never quite resolved these tensions. The Medici popes themselves are perhaps the most visible expression of this merging of banking dynasty and ecclesiastical authority. There were, in fact, multiple members of the Medici family who wore the papal tiara, and their reigns were marked by extravagance, patronage, debt, and a peculiar kind of crisis that comes when you inherit absolute spiritual authority, but find yourself constrained by the same practical financial limitations that constrain all of us. How do you maintain the appearance of divine grace while essentially running a business? How do you demand poverty from your clergy while spending fortunes on art? How do you preach simplicity from the throne of the apostles while employing the most sophisticated financial instruments available to raise money? These are the questions that will guide us through the coming hours, as we move slowly through the lives and times of the people who lived inside this contradiction, who benefited from it, who suffered from it, and who, in some cases, found themselves ultimately destroyed by it. We'll move through Florence at the height of the Renaissance, through Vatican halls hung with masterpieces, through the quiet chambers where financial arrangements were made that would reshape the Christian world. We'll meet the architects of an empire built on credit, the collectors of beauty and power, the believers who found themselves trapped between 2 kinds of faith, faith in God and faith in the reliability of their investments. The pace of this exploration is deliberate. There's no rush to get to an ending, because the real story isn't in any single moment of triumph or catastrophe. It's in the texture of how things changed, imperceptibly at first, then all at once. It's in the understanding that history is often made not by great loud declarations, but by the quiet persistence of people who knew how to manage money, how to build relationships, how to wait for the right moment to place their piece on the board. And perhaps most importantly, it's in recognizing that these patterns, these methods of influence, these ways of translating private wealth into public authority, didn't end with the Medici. They simply evolved, refined themselves, became more sophisticated. The Medici story is their story, but it's also a template, a case study in how power actually moves through the world, and that recognition alone is worth the patient hours we're about to spend together. So settle with us into this slower, deeper version of history. Let the details accumulate like snow. Let the names and dates and careful chronologies build themselves into a landscape you can inhabit and explore. This is a story best told at night, at a pace that matches the rhythm of thought when the day's urgency has fallen away. And it begins, as so many transformative stories do, with a question that seems innocent at first, but gradually reveals itself to be profound. What happens when the people who control the money decide they want to control the church as well? In the autumn of 1397, a man named Giovanni di Bicci de Medici sat in a modest counting house in Florence, and something extraordinary began to take shape, not through conquest or bloodshed, but through the patient accumulation of numbers on a page. The Medici Bank was being born, and with it came a quiet revolution that would eventually shift the very architecture of power in Europe. Where once the authority of kings and the blessing of the church had seemed unassailable, something new was stirring in the ledgers and coin chests of Florence. Money itself, carefully managed and strategically deployed, was learning to rival the throne and the altar. Think for a moment about what power actually meant in the medieval world. It was carved out of stone fortifications, concentrated in the hands of those who could command armies, those who wore crowns, and those who dispensed the sacraments. Power spoke through force and through faith. And yet, as the 15th century unfolded, a different kind of power was quietly accumulating. It was the power that came from understanding something the medieval world had largely overlooked, that whoever holds the money holds the keys to nearly everything else, that whoever can lend to a king, whoever can finance a war, whoever can manage the vast treasuries of the church itself, possesses a kind of authority that no amount of royal blood or ecclesiastical robes can easily dismiss. The Mediterranean trade networks of the early 1400s were expanding in ways both subtle and profound. Venetian galleys moved silk and spices, Genoese merchants controlled routes to the east, and throughout this dance of commerce, Florence positioned itself not as a producer of goods, but as something far more valuable, a city of bankers. The Medici would come to lead this transformation, but they were not the first or the only ones. What made them different was their understanding of a principle that seems almost obvious in our time, but was revolutionary then. They grasped that banking itself could be an art form, that the movement and management of capital could be elevated to something approaching statecraft. When we speak of the Medici Bank, we are speaking of something that operated in the early decades according to principles that still govern banking today, though this was 4 centuries before double-entry bookkeeping became common knowledge. The family learned to establish branches in major cities across Europe. They managed accounts for wool merchants and silversmiths. They extended credit to nobility and bishops, and as they did so, they began to accumulate not just wealth, but something more subtle and far more enduring: information. They knew where money flowed. They understood the financial vulnerabilities of great houses. They could see, in the fine detail of their ledgers, the patterns of power shifting beneath the surface of ostensible rule. The beauty of the Medici innovation lay in its apparent modesty. A banker does not march on a city. A banker does not pronounce excommunications or crown sovereigns. A banker simply holds the keys to the money chest and gently, patiently, suggests the terms by which great men might access what they need. Consider the position of a medieval prince, powerful in theory but perpetually in debt, the costs of maintaining a court, of constructing the symbols of power, of ensuring loyalty through generous patronage. These were endless. A prince might possess vast territories and command loyalty from nobles, but if his exchequer was empty, if his creditors were calling in their debts, his practical authority began to evaporate. Now imagine the banker sitting quietly opposite such a prince, offering a solution. The banker does not need to threaten. The banker simply needs to be indispensable. The church, too, was particularly vulnerable to this subtle shift in power. The papacy had always relied on enormous revenues to fund its operations, to maintain Rome, to support the hierarchy of bishops and cardinals, and to project the majesty of Christendom. But these revenues were scattered and irregular. The sale of church positions, the collection of tithes from across Catholic Europe, the donations of the faithful, These came in at unpredictable times and through uncertain channels. A pope might possess spiritual authority over millions, might possess the power to open and close the gates of heaven in the eyes of the faithful, but he could not manufacture money, and money, increasingly, was what he needed. This became the particular genius of the Medici position. They would become the church's bankers, and in doing so, they would position themselves not as servants of papal authority, but as something approaching partners in its exercise. The ledgers themselves tell us something remarkable about how this transition occurred. They show not a family that seized power through bold strokes, but one that accumulated influence through reliability and competence. The Medici reputation for honesty, for keeping accurate accounts, for making good on their promises, these were not the stuff of poetry, but they were the foundation of everything that followed. A merchant lending money in 1420 needed to trust that he would be repaid. A pope, arranging for funds to be transferred from Rome to some distant outpost, needed to be certain that the money would arrive intact. The Medici earned this trust through decades of careful practice, and as that trust grew, so did their reach. What makes this transition so fascinating to contemplate in the quietness of night is that it represents a kind of invisible revolution. There were no manifestos, no dramatic moments when power visibly changed hands. Instead, there was the gradual accretion of influence through financial acumen. A ledger, in the hands of someone who understands both numbers and human nature, becomes a tool of governance. The banker who knows a king, owes him a fortune, exercises a particular kind of leverage. The banker who manages papal finances understands secrets that even cardinals do not. The banker who can arrange for funds to flow from one corner of Europe to another holds threads of control that stretch across kingdoms. As the century progressed and the Medici position strengthened, people began to whisper about the true seat of power in Florence. It was not, some suggested, necessarily found in the formal halls of government. The family maintained a kind of studied humility in their public posture, avoiding titles and grand displays, at least in the early generations. And yet everyone understood that to accomplish anything significant in Florence, one needed the cooperation, or at least the non-opposition, of the Medici. They were not rulers in the traditional sense, not yet, but they were something newer, something that the medieval categories of power had not yet developed language for. They were men who controlled the mechanisms by which power could be exercised. In the shadows of Florence's great cathedral, in the quiet chambers where merchants met to discuss their dealings, in the carefully maintained record books stored in secure rooms, a new kind of authority was taking shape. It was written in numbers rather than decrees, expressed through loans and investments rather than laws, backed by the quiet confidence that comes from knowing the financial secrets of your society. By the early 1400s, as Giovanni de Bicci's careful stewardship began to bear fruit, the stage was being set for a transformation that would eventually place not just the Medici among the great powers of Europe, but would place one of their own within the very heart of Christendom. The coin, it seemed, was learning to speak with a voice that rivaled even the bells of the cathedral. And so we arrive at the man whose patient hands first shaped the Medici fortune into something formidable, something that would eventually rival the crowns of nations. Giovanni de Bicci de Medici, born in the year 1360, in a time when banking was still half craft, half mystery, when most men trusted their gold to prayer and locked boxes rather than to ledgers and human judgment. He was not born to extraordinary circumstance. His father, Averardo, had engaged in some modest wool trading, but Giovanni arrived into a world where the family name held no particular weight, no great offices, no presumed destiny. What he possessed instead was something far more valuable, an observant mind, a temperament suited to patience, and perhaps most crucially, an understanding that power need not announce itself loudly. While noble families spent their days in courts and councils, Declaring their ambitions from marble steps, Giovanni turned his attention inward, toward the quiet machinery of money itself. He began his working life in the banking house of the Bardi family, one of Florence's great financial dynasties, learning the intricate choreography of credit and trust that allowed merchants to move goods and coin across the treacherous distances of medieval Europe. It is worth pausing here to consider what banking actually meant in this era. There were no paper currencies as we know them, no central banks issuing notes. Instead, there were accountants, letters of credit, relationships built over years and decades, the exchange of coin from one city's standard to another's, the lending of money at interest, in an age when the Church officially condemned usury as a mortal sin. And yet the Church itself needed money moved, needed access to funds scattered across Christendom, needed trustworthy men to manage the flow of Peter's pence from distant parishes back to Rome. This paradox, that banking was sinful, and yet the Church could not survive without it, would become the great lever by which the Medici would one day raise themselves to unimaginable heights. But Giovanni's ascent was not swift. By all surviving accounts, he worked for the Bardi for many years, accumulating knowledge, observing how transactions were recorded, how trust was maintained, how profit could be extracted from the simple fact that different cities valued coin differently, that a florin in Rome was not quite the same coin as a florin in Bruges. He was learning the silent language of mathematics and reputation. Around the year 1397, when Giovanni was already in his middle years, an age when most men had either failed or settled into comfortable mediocrity, he established his own banking house. Not with a grand proclamation or a magnificent palazzo, but quietly, methodically, with capital drawn partly from his own accumulated savings and partly from family connections. The firm was named simply the Medici Bank, and it opened its operations in Florence, that city of red-tiled roofs and bitter political feuds, where rival families jockeyed for advantage through bloodshed and alliance. What made Giovanni's approach different? It was his deliberate expansion of the banking network itself. Rather than consolidating his operations in a single city, as many bankers did, he began establishing branches, in Rome first, then in Venice, then in other commercial centers. Each branch was managed by a trusted partner, often a family member, but all were connected by an ingenious system of accounting and correspondence that allowed the firm to function as a unified whole across vast distances. If a Florentine merchant needed credit in London, or a Roman cardinal needed funds transferred to Naples, the Medici Bank could facilitate it, taking a small percentage for their service and building their reputation one careful transaction at a time. His relationship with the papacy deserves particular attention, for it was the cornerstone upon which the family's later power would be built. The papal states, the territories ruled directly by the Pope, generated revenue from their lands, but the Church's actual income came from tithes, from offerings, from the sale of sacramental objects and privileges, money that flowed in from parishes and monasteries across Christendom. How was this money to be collected, counted, and transported safely back to Rome? Through bankers, trustworthy bankers, discreet bankers, and as Giovanni's reputation grew for his scrupulous honesty, his accurate record-keeping, his ability to move money without losing it to thieves or shipwrecks, the Church increasingly turned to him. What we might call patronage, Giovanni would have understood as mutual interest. He provided the papacy with financial services they desperately needed. In return, they granted him their business, their trust, and implicitly, their goodwill. A man who controlled the Church's purse strings held a kind of power that could never be threatened by a nobleman's sword, because the nobleman still needed money to feed his armies, to build his fortresses, to conduct his wars. And if the papacy was indebted to you, if the Church's financial fate rested partly in your hands, then even kings had reason to treat you with caution. But Giovanni himself never seemed particularly impressed by the scope of what he was building. The documents and letters that survive from his era suggest a man focused on the immediate task, the accuracy of his ledgers, the reliability of his agents, the quality of the relationships he cultivated. When his son Cosimo was born, in the year 1409, Giovanni was already in his 50s, a man of established reputation, though not yet the towering figure he would become in the memory of his descendants. There is something almost touching, in a way, about contemplating Giovanni de Bicci's life. He built no cathedral, commissioned no paintings that we remember today, delivered no orations that rang through the halls of power. He did something quieter and more enduring. He established a system. He created a mechanism by which wealth could flow and accumulate, could be reinvested, could grow. He demonstrated that a man of talent and integrity, operating according to certain principles, could build something substantial and stable. He proved that in the late medieval world, the man with the ledger might eventually prove more powerful than the man with the sword, though it would take generations and the subtle interplay of fortune and ambition for that truth to be fully realized. When Giovanni died in 1429, at the advanced age of 68, he left behind not a legendary reputation. Most people outside banking circles knew little of him, but something more valuable still. He left behind a functioning system, a network of trusted associates, a set of practices that separated the Medici from their competitors. He left behind a foundation upon which someone far more ambitious could build. And that someone, his son Cosimo, was already waiting in the wings, observing, learning, preparing to transform what his father had carefully constructed into something that would touch the very fabric of European power. By the middle of that century, the Medici Bank's fortune had grown so quietly and so completely that the family no longer needed to shout. The wealth was there, patient in the ledgers, compounding year after year like interest itself, which, the church reminded the faithful, was a sin, and yet here the Medici were, gathering it methodically, and the church itself would eventually depend upon their skill in doing so. But Giovanni de Bicci had understood something his son would perfect, that true power in Florence required not just florins in a vault, but the ability to move through the city as though you were merely another citizen, another patron of the arts, another pious family with a chapel and an interest in the common good. This was Cosimo di Giovanni de Medici, called Cosimo the Elder, born in 1389, and he inherited not just his father's bank, but his father's discretion, a quality rarer and more valuable than gold itself. Where other wealthy families in Florence, the Strozzi, the Albizzi, the Pazzi, competed openly for influence, building grand palaces and parading their power through the streets, Cosimo cultivated something far more durable. He understood that Florence in those decades was a republic in name, governed by elaborate councils and elected magistrates. All of it, a delicate theatre, performed for the benefit of those who held real power behind the scenes. The question became not how to seize the city openly, but how to make certain that whatever decisions the city made, they would benefit the Medici. He did this, in part, through patronage so generous and so carefully distributed that it became difficult to distinguish between his personal wealth and the wealth of Florence itself. When the cathedral needed funds, the great Duomo, that cathedral with its red dome that still rises above the city today, Cosimo contributed. When artists needed commissions, when families needed loans at reasonable interest, when neighborhoods wanted improvements to their streets or aqueducts, the Medici were there, not as tyrants imposing their will, but as benefactors offering solutions to the city's needs. The effect was subtle but profound. To benefit Florence came to mean, in practice, to benefit the Medici. There is a kind of political genius in this arrangement, one that does not appear in chronicles written for kings and warfare. Cosimo never declared himself ruler. He held no grand title beyond the simple role of banker and citizen. Yet by the 1430s, Florence moved as though Cosimo had whispered direction into its ear. Elections favoured candidates he had chosen to support. The councils that governed the city, though filled with men from other families, seemed inevitably to reach conclusions that aligned with Medici interests. When necessary, he could arrange the exile of rivals. The Albizzi family, once the dominant power in Florence, found themselves cast out of the city entirely, their influence dissolved almost without bloodshed, almost without anyone being quite able to say who had decided it. Yet Cosimo was careful to preserve the fiction of democratic governance. Florence liked to think of itself as a free republic, inherited from the ancient Roman model, and Cosimo understood that this self-image was worth preserving. To destroy it openly would have invited resentment and rebellion. Instead, he worked within it, around it, through it, becoming perhaps the first of a new kind of ruler, not a prince with a crown, but a banker with a ledger, whose power rested not on inherited authority or military might, but on the simple fact that everyone owed him something. A merchant needed credit. A young artist needed patronage. A family needed connections. A church needed funds. The Medici Bank could provide all of these things, and in providing them, Cosimo wove himself into the very fabric of Florentine life. His piety was genuine, or at least carefully indistinguishable from genuine. The Medici Chapel, their private space within the Church of San Lorenzo, was decorated with frescoes that depicted sacred scenes and family members in attitudes of prayer. Cosimo would be shown kneeling before the Virgin, his face reverent, his hands folded. Was this faith or calculation? The answer, perhaps, is that the question itself misses something important. In a city where power and religion were inseparable, where the church blessed the social order and legitimized the authority of those who governed, piety was not the opposite of political cunning. It was a form of it. To be truly faithful, or to appear truly faithful, amounted to much the same thing in the eyes of those around you. Cosimo also understood the power of silence and absence. While other powerful men might have surrounded themselves with courtiers and admirers, building palaces designed to advertise their status, Cosimo lived relatively modestly, at least compared to the extremes of wealth available to him. He dressed well but not ostentatiously. He moved through Florence with a small retinue. He listened more than he spoke, a habit that made people trust him and that allowed him to gather information with remarkable efficiency. Those who needed something from him had to come to him, and in that audience, that private moment where a request was made and a response given, the balance of obligation tilted subtly but decisively in his favor. Consider what this meant for a young painter or sculptor. A man with talent, perhaps, but without family connections or wealth, would find his path through the world constrained. But if Cosimo took an interest in him, commissioned a work, introduced him to other patrons within his circle, suddenly the young man's prospects transformed. He would remember the Medici as his benefactor. When he prospered, when he became celebrated, that memory would persist, and if he ever gained influence or position, the Medici could count on his gratitude. This principle, applied across hundreds of relationships, with artists, monks, merchants, minor nobility, professional men, created a network of obligation that bound the city to the family in ways that laws or coercion never could. The relationship between Cosimo and the city began to assume an almost familial quality. People spoke of him with a kind of affection, a sense that he cared for Florence as a father cares for his children. Florence, in turn, seemed to reciprocate, treating him with a deference usually reserved for elected officials. When his son Piero became ill, there were prayers said for his recovery throughout the city. When Cosimo himself grew old, and he lived into his 80s, a remarkable span for the time, Florence awaited his counsel as though the city itself might fall ill if he did. It is worth pausing to consider how strange and unprecedented all of this was. For centuries, Power in Italian cities had meant either inherited nobility or military conquest. It had meant castles and armies, proclamations and visible symbols of authority. The idea that a man might rule, effectively and completely, through the quiet exercise of economic influence and cultural patronage was something new under the sun. And yet it worked. It worked so thoroughly that centuries later, historians would still be debating the precise sources of Cosimo's power, unable to quite locate where the official authority ended and his personal influence began. By the 1450s, after 4 decades of guiding Florence with the lightest of hands, Cosimo had created something that would outlive him, a system of power so thoroughly embedded in the city's institutions and habits of thought that it would persist almost automatically even after his death. The Medici had become, in effect, inseparable from Florence itself. To speak of the city's prosperity was to acknowledge Medici patronage. To enjoy the beauty of its buildings and art was to benefit from their taste and generosity. To participate in its government was to operate within frameworks they had shaped. And yet Cosimo himself would eventually retire from much of this activity, withdrawing into something like philosophical contemplation in his final years. This too was political genius. By stepping back from explicit power, he allowed his successors more room to maneuver while retaining the reverence that had accumulated around his name. He had become, quite deliberately, a kind of secular saint in his own city, a figure of wisdom and restraint, to whom people looked for guidance even when he was no longer actively giving it. He had transformed himself from a banker into something like the soul of Florence, and that transformation would echo through the city's history for centuries to come. By the middle of the 15th century, the Medici had become something far more consequential than mere merchants, though they had begun exactly there, with the cloth trade and wool in Florence's humid markets. What transformed them, what lifted them into the realm of true power, was a subtle and nearly invisible shift in who they lent money to and on what terms. If Florence was the stage upon which the Medici performed their daily commerce, then Rome, the seat of the Catholic Church itself, became the stage upon which they performed their greatest financial act. The papacy, you see, has always been a costly institution. The maintenance of St. Peter's Basilica alone consumed vast sums. The cardinals required palaces. The Swiss Guard demanded wages. The administration of Christendom's spiritual empire, the clergymen scattered across every kingdom, the monasteries, the bishops with their retinues, all of this required money, enormous amounts of money, flowing constantly from the church's coffers like water through a sieve. And yet the church, for all its spiritual authority, was not always wealthy in the way that bankers understood wealth. The church possessed lands, certainly, and the faithful gave generously, but the rhythm of that giving was unpredictable, seasonal, insufficient for the grand ambitions of ambitious popes. This is where the Medici entered, so gently that few at the time fully grasped what was happening. In the early part of the 15th century, the Medici Bank began to handle not merely small transactions for the church, but the vast apparatus of papal finance itself. They became, in effect, the personal bankers to the Pope. To understand the weight of this position, one must imagine holding the keys to an institution's entire financial existence. The Medici did not merely lend money to Rome, they managed it. They received tithes and donations from across Christendom, from England to Constantinople, and they routed them through their own ledgers, their own vaults, their own carefully marked accounts. Giovanni de Bicci, that meticulous founder of Medici fortune, had already established a branch of the family bank in Rome itself, staffed with trusted associates who understood both the mathematics of banking and, perhaps more importantly, the delicate dance of ecclesiastical politics. But it was his son Cosimo who truly transformed this commercial relationship into something approaching genuine power. When Cosimo took charge of the family business, he understood an essential truth about the relationship between creditor and debtor. The debtor is never truly free. The papacy needed the Medici Bank far more than the Medici needed any single pope, and yet the Medici needed the papacy's legitimacy, its spiritual authority, its vast network of influence that extended into every corner of Christendom. It was a marriage of convenience, perfectly balanced, profitable for both parties, and profoundly consequential. The specific mechanics of this arrangement operated through what might seem to the modern ear almost mundane. The Medici would extend credit to the papal treasury. In exchange, the Medici received a monopoly on managing certain ecclesiastical revenues, most notably the alum trade. Alum, a mineral used in the dyeing of cloth, was found in significant quantities in papal territories and was essential to the textile industry throughout Europe. By controlling its sale and distribution, by managing the transactions, the Medici extracted what we might call a service fee, though the word fee hardly captures the steady stream of profit that resulted. But perhaps more valuable than any single commodity was the information that came with this position. The Medici bankers, sitting in their Roman offices, could observe the flow of money through the church with a clarity no cardinal possessed. They knew which bishops were wealthy, which dioceses were struggling. They understood the church's debts, its surpluses, its hidden expenses. In an age before modern accounting, this knowledge was itself a form of power. It allowed the Medici to advise popes, subtly, always deferentially, but with the quiet confidence of those who understand the financial reality beneath the spiritual rhetoric. There is something almost poignant in contemplating the relationship between these two institutions. The Pope, the supposed head of Christendom, the spiritual father to millions, was dependent upon the wisdom and forbearance of a family of Florentine bankers. The Church's entire capacity to project power, to build magnificent churches, to support armies when necessary, to maintain its diplomatic apparatus across Europe, rested partly upon the Medici Bank's willingness to extend credit and manage the flow of funds. One might wonder, in the quiet of these late hours, whether the popes of that era felt a certain sting in this dependency, or whether they simply accepted it as the price of maintaining their splendor. Did they lie awake in their private chambers, contemplating the irony that their spiritual authority was shadowed by financial obligation, or did they sleep peacefully, secure in the knowledge that the Medici, as good Catholics, would never allow the Church itself to fall? The reality, of course, was more complicated than either scenario. The popes and the Medici were not antagonists. They were partners in a grand enterprise of mutual benefit. The Medici received wealth, prestige, and the protection of the Church's influence. The Church received the financial acumen and resources necessary to maintain its position in a world increasingly governed by commerce and calculation. By the time the middle of the 15th century had given way to its later decades, the Medici Bank had become, in every practical sense, the Vatican's bank. The family maintained offices in Rome, staffed with their most trusted accountants and money managers. These men, for they were almost invariably men, understood both the language of ledgers and the language of cardinals. They moved through the halls of the papal palace with a certain ease, their presence taken for granted, their advice sought on matters that seemed to be purely spiritual, but which, like so much in human institutions, had a financial foundation beneath them. Consider the quiet ambition that drove this arrangement. The Medici were not content to be wealthy merchants in Florence. They had begun a long, patient work of translating commercial power into political and ecclesiastical influence. By becoming the Church's banker, they had inserted themselves into the very machinery of papal governance. They were not popes themselves, not yet, but they had become something that popes could not ignore. They had become indispensable. And indispensability, as any student of power has long understood, is the most secure foundation upon which to build greater ambitions. By the time Lorenzo came of age in the 1460s, Florence had already become something more than a city of merchants and bankers. It had become a city where money spoke in a language almost indistinguishable from beauty. The Medici fortune, by then 3 generations deep and spread across the financial networks of Christendom, had begun to ask itself a question that only immense wealth can afford to ask. What is all of this for? And the answer Lorenzo found, or perhaps inherited and refined, was something that would ripple through centuries. It was not mere accumulation. It was the transformation of coin into culture, of ledgers into legacy. Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici took control of the family business and the city's invisible threads when he was still in his 20s, and he possessed something his forebears, for all their acumen, had lacked in quite the same measure. He possessed an hunger not just for power, but for beauty, for philosophy, for the impossible marriage of reason and spirit that the ancients had once pursued. And because he possessed both the wealth to indulge this hunger and the political instinct to make it seem like generosity rather than vanity, Florence under his hand became something that had never quite existed before. The city's streets, you must understand, were not yet the tourist postcards of later centuries. They were workshops and stone and the dust of commerce. But within those streets, and in the villas that dotted the Florentine hills, there grew something quieter and more profound. There grew gatherings of minds. There grew the slow excavation and resurrection of texts, thought lost, of philosophies buried under centuries of Christian certainty. The Medici Bank had the gold, but Lorenzo seemed to understand that gold was merely the key to unlock something far older and far stranger. It was in these years, perhaps around 1462, that there took root what would come to be called the Platonic Academy. Not a formal institution in the way we might imagine it now, with buildings and rosters and official seals. Rather, it was a circle, a constellation of scholars and philosophers who gathered in the villas and gardens of the Medici, drawn together by their fascination with a particular obsession, the recovery of Plato. Not Aristotle, who had remained familiar throughout the medieval centuries, but Plato himself, whose complete works had only recently been retrieved from Byzantine sources. The very idea that one might sit and read Plato in Greek, actually Plato rather than fragments quoted through intermediaries, was itself revolutionary, and it was Medici patronage, Medici gold, that made this possible. The figure at the heart of this circle was a man named Marsilio Ficino. Picture him, if you will, in a quieter moment, perhaps in a garden overlooking the Arno, surrounded by books and the soft rustling of manuscript pages. Ficino was not a nobleman, nor was he born to power or privilege. He was a scholar, the son of a physician, and Lorenzo elevated him because he recognized in him something precious, a genuine intellectual fervor that could not be bought but only supported, nourished, given space to bloom. Lorenzo made Ficino director of the Platonic Academy, though again, there was nothing official about the title. It was a recognition, a blessing, and Ficino repaid it by becoming one of the great translators and synthesizers of his age, a man who devoted his life to showing that Plato and Plotinus, the ancient philosophers, were not enemies of Christian faith, but rather had been pointing toward Christian truths all along. This was a delicate argument, you understand. In many quarters of the church, the rediscovery of pagan philosophy was viewed with deep suspicion. Heresy lurked in those old books. Danger, contradiction. How could a Christian sit comfortably with Plato's theory of forms or his discussions of the immortal soul? And yet Ficino, working under the gentle protection of Medici patronage and Medici gold, set about arguing that these were not contradictions at all, that the ancient philosophers, in their own way, had been seeking the same eternal truths that Christianity claimed to offer, that Plato had been, in some sense, a proto-Christian, groping toward revelation through the lens of reason. Whether one accepts this synthesis or not, the effect was electric. It opened a space in Florence where it became possible to be both pious and philosophical, both a Christian and a lover of the pagan ancients. It created an atmosphere where the mind could move in multiple directions at once, where tradition and innovation could sit at the same table and converse. And all of this was enabled by Medici money and, perhaps more importantly, by Medici protection. Lorenzo could afford to be a patron of dangerous ideas because he was secure enough in his own power to permit them. The Academy attracted others, drawn to Florence as if to a light. There was Pico della Mirandola, a young nobleman whose intellectual gifts were so prodigious that he seemed to embody the very possibility of human potential that the Renaissance was beginning to celebrate. Pico believed that humans possessed a unique freedom, a capacity to choose their own nature, to transcend the fixed hierarchies of the medieval worldview. It was a heady idea and a dangerous one in the eyes of church authorities. Yet under Medici patronage, Pico flourished, at least for a time. There was the poet Poliziano, master of the Italian vernacular, who brought the philosophical conversations into the realm of poetry and literature. There was the humanist scholar Cristoforo Landino, a whole circle of minds, all orbiting the Medici sun. And what did they discuss in these quiet gardens and candlelit rooms? They discussed the nature of beauty itself. Is beauty divine? Is it a glimpse of eternal forms? They discussed whether the soul was immortal, and if so, what implications that had for how one should live. They discussed love, not merely romantic love, but the love of wisdom, the love of goodness. They read Plato's Symposium together and debated its meanings deep into the evening. There is something almost unbearably moving about the image of Renaissance scholars, candlelight catching on the pages of ancient manuscripts, arguing about whether the soul survives the body, whether love is a ladder to the divine. All of this possible because a young banker, not yet 30, had decided to spend his fortune not on armies or monuments, but on the resurrection of ancient thought. And yet Lorenzo was not merely a patron in the abstract sense. He did not simply hand over money and retreat. He participated. He was, by all accounts, one of the members of this circle, a genuine member, not merely its benefactor. He read the texts, he attended the gatherings, he even wrote poetry himself, competent if not brilliant, verse that showed the influence of the philosophical conversations he was immersed in. This level of participation, not as a distant sponsor, but as an actual member, was remarkable. How many rulers would have had the intellectual courage, the genuine curiosity, to sit with philosophers and debate the nature of eternal forms? How many would have risked their dignity in that way? And what was the larger purpose? What did Lorenzo believe this resurrection of Platonism could accomplish? Perhaps this is speculation, but it seems that he believed it could accomplish something almost miraculous, the creation of a human civilization that was both rational and spiritual, both grounded in reason and elevated by faith, a Florence, and through Florence, an Italy, that could recover what had been lost in the medieval centuries, not Christian faith itself, but a certain kind of intellectual and spiritual vitality that Christian faith, when allied with genuine philosophy, could generate. The irony, of course, was that this vision of a united Christian and Platonic civilization, of faith enlightened by reason, was being pursued at the very moment when the medieval synthesis was beginning to crack from within. Within a few decades, Martin Luther would walk into a church and see in it not the harmonious marriage of reason and faith that Ficino envisioned, but rather corruption, hypocrisy, and the suppression of truth. But in these years, in the 1460s and 1470s, in the gardens of Florence under Medici patronage, there was still hope. There was still the belief that the mind and the spirit could dance together, that philosophy could serve faith rather than undermine it. And this is what made Lorenzo's Florence different from other wealthy cities of the time. It was not merely rich, it was intellectually alive in a way that few places have ever been. The Renaissance, that term we use so easily now, was not inevitable. It was not a force of nature. It was created, supported, shaped, directed by men with money who chose to spend it on what they believed mattered most. And what Lorenzo believed mattered most was the free play of human intelligence in pursuit of eternal truth. For a brief, shining moment in European history, that was possible in Florence. It was possible because one young banker had the wealth and the wisdom to make it so. Not every story of power accumulation unfolds in ledgers and slow, careful accumulation. And so we arrive, gently, at a moment when the Medici's rise, which had been so patient, so methodical, so wrapped in the language of commerce and patronage, encountered something fiercer, something that moved with the speed of daggers drawn in a cathedral. This is the Pazzi conspiracy, a name that has echoed through Florentine history for centuries, and though it carries within it the shadow of violence, we may approach it as historians do, not as a shock to the senses, but as a turning point, a moment when rival families and their ambitions collided in a way that would reshape the city's fate. To understand why this moment mattered, we must first understand who the Pazzi were. The Pazzi family, like the Medici, had built their wealth through banking and trade. They too had connections throughout Italy, throughout Europe, throughout the Mediterranean world. But where the Medici had chosen a path of subtle influence, of being the power behind the throne rather than upon it, the Pazzi, by the 1470s, had grown restless. They were prosperous, certainly. They were respected. And yet they watched as Lorenzo the Magnificent gathered artists and philosophers around him, as the Medici name became synonymous with Florence itself, with beauty, with enlightenment, with the very definition of what the Renaissance could be. It is human nature, perhaps, to wonder what might have been had circumstances differed, and the Pazzi wondered this too. They wondered what Florence might look like under their guidance. They wondered whether their own taste, their own vision, their own banking acumen might not serve the city just as well. These wonderings, these quiet resentments, these visions of an alternate Florence, they began to ferment in quiet meetings, in the chambers of Pazzi palaces, in the minds of men who had grown tired of standing in someone else's shadow. By some accounts, it was not the Pazzi alone who felt this way. There were other families, other interests, other factions within Florence who saw Lorenzo's power as having grown too absolute. And perhaps most significantly, there were forces outside Florence, the Pope himself, or rather those who advised the Pope, or those who used the Pope's authority for their own ends. The political landscape of Italy in the 1470s was a tapestry of shifting alliances. The Papal States held territory and authority. Venice held its maritime dominance. Milan, under the Sforza, held its own weight. And Florence, under the Medici, held something perhaps more subtle but equally potent, the ability to move money, to create alliances, to bend the will of others through the simple fact of financial dependency. And so, gradually, over months and perhaps years, a conspiracy began to take shape. It was not announced, it did not declare itself, but various threads began to be woven together. The Pazzi consulted with others who harbored grievances. They reached out to Pope Sixtus IV, or rather to those around him. They made contact with the Kingdom of Naples, which had its own reasons to wish the Medici diminished. They assembled, in the language of historical documents, a coalition, though it was a coalition born of calculation rather than conviction, of ambition rather than ideology. The question that historians have gently posed over the centuries is this: what exactly was the plan? And here we must acknowledge that the historical record grows somewhat uncertain, somewhat colored by the perspective of the victors, but the broad outline is clear enough. There was to be a stroke, a decisive action, an ending of the Medici dominance, perhaps through the removal of Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano from power. Some accounts suggest darker intentions. Others are less explicit. What is certain is that violence was contemplated, and that violence was, ultimately, what transpired. The moment itself came on Easter Sunday, April 26th, in the year 1478. Lorenzo and Giuliano were at the Cathedral of Florence, attending services at the height of the holy day. It was a moment when the city was gathered, when attention was focused inward toward faith and celebration, rather than outward toward politics and intrigue. The conspirators had chosen their moment with the cunning of people who understood the symbolic power of sacred space violated, of divine service interrupted. What happened next we may describe in measured tones, as history does. There was an attempt on the lives of the Medici brothers. Giuliano, the younger, was killed, struck down, the records tell us, with multiple wounds. Lorenzo, the elder, the one upon whom the family's power truly rested, was wounded but managed to escape, taking refuge in the cathedral itself, barring the doors behind him. The violence, the chaos, the moment of blood spilled in a house of God, these things occurred, and yet we need not linger in the sensory details of them. History has already recorded them. What matters more, in the quiet hours of the night, is what came after. Because what happened after the Pazzi conspiracy was, in many ways, more telling than the conspiracy itself. The conspiracy failed. That is the most important fact. Lorenzo survived. The Medici power, rather than being shattered, proved resilient. And more than that, the failure of the conspiracy seemed to consolidate Medici authority rather than diminish it. Florence, shocked, appalled perhaps by the violation of sacred space, by the blood spilled in its cathedral, rallied around Lorenzo. The people of the city, far from rising up to support the conspirators, instead turned against them. In the days and weeks that followed, Florence was gripped by a kind of justice. The Pazzi family was hunted down. Many of them were arrested, tried, and executed. Their properties were confiscated. Their names were struck from records. It was a thorough and methodical unraveling of a rival house. And while these acts, these executions, these confiscations were the harsh realities of Renaissance politics, they also served to underscore a simple fact. The Medici were no longer merely one family among many in Florence. They were now, unmistakably, the power. Yet there is something else worth noting, something that emerges when we look at Lorenzo's response with the eyes of someone who understands not just the violence, but the psychology of power. Lorenzo, in the aftermath, showed himself to be not merely a tyrant seeking revenge, but a political actor of considerable sophistication. He used the moment to consolidate authority, yes, but he also used it to deepen his connections, to make alliances with those who might have been wavering, to position himself as the defender of Florence itself against those who would tear it apart from within. Some historians have suggested that the Pazzi conspiracy, in a strange way, was the making of Lorenzo the Magnificent, that it was the moment when his power, previously rooted in wealth and patronage and influence, became power rooted in something darker, something more absolute. He had survived an assassination attempt. He had seen his brother killed, and he had emerged not diminished but strengthened. The mathematics of Florentine politics had shifted, and yet, if we think about it gently, without allowing ourselves to become trapped in the melodrama of it all, what we see is something more subtle. The conspiracy represented a last gasp of the old way of doing things in Florence, a way in which various families competed directly, violently, for supremacy. The Pazzi believed that they could restore an older order, one in which power was more distributed, more contested, more open to challenge. But what happened instead was that the Medici, through the accident of surviving this challenge, became even more completely the custodians of Florence's fate. The age of competing families was ending. The age of Medici rule, absolute and unchallenged, was beginning. The mist still rises from the Arno, as it did in those spring days of 1478. The cathedral still stands where blood was spilled in the service of ambition, and the Pazzi name, though it persists in Florence's history books and in certain palazzo walls, would never again carry the weight of genuine challenge to Medici supremacy. The conspiracy had failed not because the Pazzi lacked courage or cunning, but because the moment for such challenges had passed. The future belonged to different kinds of power, the power of a family so thoroughly woven into the fabric of a city that to tear them out would be to tear out the very threads holding it together. The question that must have whispered through the marble halls of the Medici Palazzo, in those long afternoons when ledgers were closed and the family gathered, was something like this: if we hold Rome's purse, why should we not hold Rome's throne itself? The leap from banker to bishop is not as far as it might seem. Both positions rest on the accumulation of trust. Both involve the careful management of wealth that belongs, in theory, to others. Both require an understanding that power flows not always from the loudest voice, but from the hand that controls the purse strings, the one that decides where gold flows and where it pools. By the time the 15th century had settled into its closing decades, the Medici had grown so accustomed to influence that ambition began to shift. They had managed money for the church, yes. They had lent to cardinals and bishops, had financed the building of chapels and the commissioning of frescoes. But there was a hunger that mere patronage could not satisfy. The church was not simply another client. The church was the gateway to a different kind of immortality, a form of power that transcended the merely earthly, that touched the divine itself, or so it seemed. If a Medici could not become king, then why not pope? This was not a desire that announced itself loudly. The Medici were too subtle for that, too versed in the language of suggestion and implication, but it shaped every move they made in Rome, every cardinal they supported, every gift they gave to ambitious clergy who might one day remember their benefactors. It was a kind of patient gardening, where you plant seeds not knowing which will bloom, but knowing that some, eventually, must. The path was open, in ways that would have seemed impossible centuries before. The buying and selling of church offices had become, by this time, almost routine. Cardinals were chosen, not for holiness, but for bloodline and capability. Bishops received their appointments because powerful families had backed them, had invested in them as one might invest in land or trade goods. The church's finances were in such disarray, its debts so tangled, that a family which understood accounting better than most of Christendom could become absolutely essential to its functioning. The Medici had made themselves indispensable, and indispensability is the gentlest form of coercion. Consider the landscape of ecclesiastical ambition that lay before them. Dozens of cardinals competed for influence, their ambitions fractured along family lines, regional loyalties, theological disputes. But the Medici had something the others lacked, wealth that was not merely inherited, but actively generated, money that flowed continuously from banking houses across Europe. A cardinal could buy votes with promises. The Medici could buy them with actual florins, with secure loans, with the backing of Italian bankers who answered to Florence. The family had placed relatives in the church for generations. This was not unusual. Nearly every great family did the same, but the Medici did it with a kind of systematic precision. A younger son, thought unsuitable for the family business, would be directed toward the clergy. An ambitious cousin might be groomed for a bishopric. The church became, in a sense, a branch of the Medici enterprise, as carefully managed as their banks, as strategically important as their political alliances. These were not necessarily cynical appointments. Many of the Medici clergy were genuinely pious, genuinely learned, but they were also Medici, and that loyalty superseded, always, any other consideration. What made their ambitions toward the church different from other families was the scale and the strategy. The Medici did not simply place a nephew or two in ecclesiastical positions and consider their work done. They systematized it. They understood, with the clarity that comes from banking, that to control something you must have multiple points of leverage. One cardinal might die, one bishop might lose influence. But if you had 5 cardinals, 10 bishops, a network of lesser clergy scattered throughout Italy and beyond, then the loss of any individual was merely an inconvenience. The structure endured. And there was another element to it, something that made the Medici different from mere ambitious families playing at placing their sons in high positions. They understood money in a way that made them invaluable to the church at the highest levels. The papal court needed banking services. The church needed loans. Tithes came in and had to be managed, invested, protected. Crusades had to be financed. The construction and maintenance of churches and monasteries required constant expenditure. A family that could organize this chaos, that could bring Florentine accounting practices to the sprawling mess of church finance, was not merely useful, it was essential. This is where the real power lay, not in the ceremonial positions or the titles, but in the practical, unglamorous work of making the vast machine function. While bishops debated theology and cardinals maneuvered for position, the Medici bankers worked in the background, their ledgers recording every transaction, every debt, every obligation. A pope might have the authority to speak with God's voice, but he needed money to feed his household, to maintain his dignity, to fund his buildings and his wars. And the money, increasingly, came through channels that the Medici controlled or influenced. There is something almost inevitable about the way these ambitions crystallized. It was not that the Medici suddenly decided to place one of their own on the papal throne. Rather, it was that the structure of their power, once constructed, naturally pointed toward such an outcome. Each cardinal they supported brought them closer. Each loan to the church increased their leverage. Each moment where a pope found himself dependent on Medici financing strengthened the argument that a Medici pope would be far more efficient, far less problematic, far more likely to manage church resources in ways that reflected the wisdom of banking and commerce. By the early years of the 16th century, the ambition had become almost respectable, almost expected. When Pope Julius II died, in the year 1513, and the cardinals gathered to elect his successor, the name of Giovanni de Medici was among those seriously considered. He was 40 years old. He had been a cardinal for nearly 2 decades, having been appointed to that position when he was barely more than a boy. He came from the family that managed the papal finances. He was intelligent, well-educated, politically sophisticated. He was, in every practical sense, the obvious choice, the safest choice, the choice that promised continuity and competent governance. And in the minds of the cardinals, both those who owed the Medici money and those who simply appreciated the logic of elevating a man who understood the church's finances, the choice must have seemed less like an ambition being fulfilled and more like a simple acknowledgement of reality. The Medici had spent a century building toward this moment, carefully, patiently, with the same attention to detail they brought to their account books. When the moment came, it did not feel like a revolution. It felt like the natural order of things settling into place. And so we arrive at the moment when the boundary between ledger and liturgy dissolved entirely. It was the year of our Lord 1513, when the College of Cardinals gathered in conclave, their voices echoing through chambers adorned with the frescoes of centuries. Among them moved a man whose hands had grown accustomed to the weight of account books rather than reliquaries, whose mind had been trained in the intricate mathematics of exchange rates and credit rather than the scriptural depths that had traditionally shaped the minds of bishops. His name was Giovanni de Medici, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and in the minds of many cardinals assembled there, he represented something novel, and entirely necessary. A man who understood not only the spiritual burdens of the church, but its financial architecture. The path to his elevation had been paved with decades of careful design. Giovanni had taken orders as a young man, a strategic choice that allowed him to wear the cassock of the clergy while maintaining the business instincts and family loyalty that defined the Medici. He had risen through the ecclesiastical ranks with a kind of quiet inevitability, accepting positions and honors that seemed to accumulate around him like snowfall on a winter evening. By the time he was made a cardinal in his late 20s, a remarkable achievement that spoke volumes about both his family's reach and the degree to which the church hierarchy had become entangled with secular power, his trajectory towards something greater seemed written in invisible ink across the corridors of Rome. When Pope Julius II died in February of that year, the machinery of succession began to turn. The cardinals, nearly all of them indebted in some way to great families across Europe, entered conclave, aware that this election would shape not merely the spiritual direction of Christendom, but the economic and political fate of Italy itself. And what did they find in Giovanni de Medici? A man barely 37 years old, a cardinal whose family held the purse strings of the church itself, a member of a dynasty that had transformed mere banking into statecraft, that had turned the careful notation of figures into the art of influence. His election came swiftly, suspiciously so. Within weeks, Giovanni took the papal name Leo X, a choice that itself carried meaning, harking back to Leo I, who had used both spiritual authority and shrewd negotiation to navigate the perilous currents of the early church. Perhaps he hoped to invoke that precedent. Perhaps it was merely tradition. Either way, the transformation was complete. The Medici banking heir had become the vicar of Christ. Imagine for a moment the strangeness of it, the peculiar alchemy this moment represented. For centuries, the church had stood as the ultimate moral authority, the guardian of souls and the dispenser of grace. Its popes had been theologians, mystics, and administrators, men who had worn the mantle of spiritual leadership as the central fact of their existence. But now, standing in the Vatican, occupying the throne of Saint Peter himself, was a man whose first instinct was to think like a merchant. How does one maximize the revenue of a vast ecclesiastical enterprise? How does one balance the spiritual mission with the material needs of maintaining a temporal kingdom? These were the questions that had shaped Giovanni de Medici's mind long before he ever wore the papal tiara. Yet it would be unfair to suggest that he was purely a businessman playing dress-up in sacred vestments. Giovanni, by all reliable accounts, possessed genuine piety. He had been educated in the classics, had been exposed to the Renaissance ferment of ideas that swirled through Florence and Rome. He understood something of theology, something of philosophy. He was not a crude or cynical man, though his elevation did represent a profound blurring of the sacred and the material. Rather, he embodied a kind of synthesis, a figure in whom the worldly and the spiritual had become so interwoven that they could no longer be easily separated. His first acts as pope were telling. Leo X began immediately to gather around himself artists and architects, to plan new works of grandeur and beauty. He confirmed the ongoing construction of St. Peter's Basilica, that vast architectural ambition that had consumed papal resources and imagination for over a century. He brought into his service some of the finest minds of the age. Raphael would become his favorite, and the painter's genius would be enlisted to beautify the Vatican, to create frescoes and designs that would outlast the Medici dynasty itself by centuries. There is a certain poetry in this, perhaps unintended but no less real. Here was a pope, elected through the machinery of family influence and financial power, whose instinct was immediately to commission beauty, to invest in art, to surround himself with creators and thinkers. It speaks to something not entirely mercenary in the Medici character, some genuine love of grandeur and magnificence, of the human desire to leave behind something permanent and beautiful. Whether this impulse was nobler than or inseparable from the profit motive remains a question without easy answer. But the practical reality was undeniable. Leo X had inherited a church in financial distress. Julius II, his predecessor, had been a warrior pope, a man who had personally led armies and spent church resources on military campaigns as readily as on spiritual works. The papal treasury was depleted, debts were mounting. The Papal States, those Italian territories directly governed by the Church, required constant investment and defense. The vast bureaucratic apparatus of Rome, the cardinals and bishops and functionaries who maintained the visible infrastructure of church authority, all expected their salaries, their perquisites, their cut of the revenues that flowed into the papal coffers. And so we find Leo X in an interesting position. He possessed, through his family, an intimate understanding of how to solve financial problems, how to innovate in the mechanisms of raising capital, how to squeeze maximum profit from every available source. He had grown up observing, perhaps even participating in, the Medici methods of banking. Double-entry bookkeeping, the careful notation of debit and credit, the use of credit instruments and letters of exchange to move money across vast distances and time. These were tools that the Medici had perfected, and they had done so in part through their management of church finances. What began to emerge, slowly but inexorably, was the notion that the church's spiritual authority might be leveraged, quite literally, to finance its own operations. One might pause here and wonder what would have happened if a different man had been elected, someone trained purely in theology and pastoral care, someone without the mercantile instincts that came with Medici blood. Would the Church have navigated its financial troubles through prayer and austerity, through a retreat from worldly magnificence? The question itself is naive, born of an innocence about human institutions and their needs. The Church was not, in the year 1513, a spiritual community that could subsist on faith and ceremony. It was a vast enterprise, employing thousands, maintaining buildings and art collections, supporting armies, conducting diplomacy across continents. It required resources, vast resources, and those resources had to come from somewhere. Yet there remained something unsettling about the symmetry of it all. Here was a man shaped by the innovation of banking, the techniques of controlled leverage and calculated debt, now at the helm of an institution that had long stood as the guardian of spiritual truth and moral authority. In his elevation lay both the culmination of Medici ambition and, perhaps, the seeds of a crisis that would eventually consume the old order of medieval Christendom. For in placing a banker on the papal throne, and let us be clear about what Giovanni de Medici was, regardless of his priesthood, Rome had endorsed a particular vision of the Church's role and purpose. It was a vision in which the spiritual and the material were not merely intertwined, but actively synthesized, merged into a single governing philosophy. And it was a vision that would, within a few short years, provoke a response that would shake the foundations of Christian Europe. The doors of the Vatican swung open for Giovanni de Medici on the 11th of March 1513, and behind them lay a city unlike any he had known in Florence, where Florence had been his family's laboratory, a place to test the alchemy of power through coin and influence. Rome was something far grander, far more demanding, and far more expensive than he could have imagined. He took the name Leo X, honoring the first pope to bear that name, and in doing so he inherited not merely the spiritual authority of the Church, but also the staggering financial machinery that kept it running, and the mounting debts that had begun to strangle it. The Vatican in those early years of Leo's papacy was less a holy sanctuary and more a vast engine of creation and ambition. The Pope found himself in possession of something that would define his entire reign, not quite limitless funds, but access to the apparatus of the Church's treasury. the Peter's pence that flowed in from faithful across Christendom, the tithes and fees and donations that accumulated like honey in a vast reservoir. And yet, almost immediately upon his elevation, Leo understood that these rivers of gold, however mighty they seemed, would need to be stretched far thinner than the demands upon them. The papal coffers, it turned out, were not bottomless. They were, in fact, running shallow. One might wonder how a pope could be poor, given the reverence and wealth that surrounded the office, but the answer lay in a truth as old as ambition itself. The greater the vision, the greater the hunger for resources. Leo's vision was nothing short of transformative. His predecessor, Julius II, had begun a project of such architectural audacity that it would consume decades and fortunes beyond measure. The reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, the spiritual heart of Christendom itself. This was not merely a renovation, this was the wholesale reimagining of the church's most sacred space, a monument that would dwarf all others, that would stand as physical proof of the church's majesty and eternal power. And it required an endless supply of marble, of skilled labor, of architectural genius, and above all, of money. Into this world of architectural ambition and financial strain stepped two men whose names would become synonymous with human genius itself. Raphael of Urbino, already in his early 30s, was brought into Leo's orbit to oversee the direction of the basilica's construction and decoration. His mind was orderly, his eye exquisite, his ability to manage both the aesthetic and practical demands of such an enormous undertaking almost preternatural. Where others saw chaos in the mounting complexity of the project, Raphael saw patterns, solutions, the possibility of harmony. He moved through the Vatican not merely as an artist, but as an architect of order itself, sketching and planning and coordinating the labor of hundreds of craftsmen and builders. And then there was Michelangelo, whose relationship with Pope Leo was far more fraught, far more complicated than the smoothly collaborative partnership that existed between the Pope and Raphael. Michelangelo had, years earlier, painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel under Julius II, a work so overwhelming in its conception and execution that it seemed to redefine what human hands could accomplish when guided by divine inspiration. Leo understood what Raphael understood as well, that the presence of such genius within one's orbit was not merely an artistic luxury, but a form of spiritual and political power. To have Michelangelo working on papal commissions was to demonstrate that the Church could command the very best that human creativity had to offer. Yet here lay a peculiar tension, one that would never quite be resolved. Both men, Raphael and Michelangelo, were working on commissions that were brilliant and necessary, but also fantastically expensive. Raphael's work included not merely the architectural direction of St. Peter's, but also the creation of magnificent frescoes, cartoons for tapestries, and designs of such intricacy and artistry that they required months and months of labor. Michelangelo was commissioned to carve a colossal marble statue, to design and oversee sculptural elements, and always there were more projects, more visions that Leo wished to see realized within the sacred walls of the Vatican. The Pope would walk through the basilica in those early years of his papacy, moving past the workers and the scaffolding and the endless noise of construction, and he would see not disorder, but the slow manifestation of his dreams. The frescoes were taking shape on the walls. The altars were being adorned with sculptures and paintings that spoke to the transcendent aspiration of the faith itself. There was something almost dreamlike about it all, a sense that one was witnessing the very process by which visions became stone and paint and lasting form. But every brushstroke, every marble block that was quarried and transported and refined, every wage paid to a laborer or a master craftsman, every pigment mixed and applied, all of it represented money flowing outward from the treasury. And the treasury, for all its apparent richness, was not infinite. This was the knowledge that must have weighed upon Leo during his quieter moments. the understanding that pressed upon him with increasing urgency as the years of his papacy accumulated. The Vatican itself during these years was a place of extraordinary aesthetic intensity. One could move from a chapel where Raphael's students were working on a fresco to a courtyard where Michelangelo was examining a block of marble, calculating in his mind how to release the form he sensed trapped within it. There were workshops where the most skilled artisans in Christendom labored, their tools and materials scattered about, their knowledge passed down through years of careful training. There were libraries and studies and chambers where cardinals moved about in their scarlet robes, conducting the business of the church, managing the vast network of dioceses and monasteries and parishes that stretched across the Christian world. And yet, alongside all this beauty, all this artistic ferment and spiritual purpose, there was a quieter current running through the Vatican. It was a current of anxiety about money, about the mounting debts that the church was accumulating, about the gap between what Leo envisioned and what the church's actual revenues could support. The bankers, and notably the Medici banking network that still operated from Florence, were watching the Pope's expenditures with increasing concern. Loans were being taken out, interest was accruing. The debt that would eventually force the church into desperate measures was beginning its slow, invisible growth. One might imagine Leo in the evenings, sitting in his private chambers, receiving reports from his treasurers and financial advisors, learning of the latest expenses, the latest commitments, the latest impossible choices between one magnificent project and another. Did he feel the weight of it? Or did the immediate joy of creation, the knowledge that under his patronage, artists of unparalleled genius were bringing forth works that would endure for centuries, did that joy outweigh the abstract anxiety of mounting debts? This question has no certain answer, but it is perhaps the central paradox of Leo's papacy, that a man so attuned to beauty, so committed to the patronage of human genius, was gradually presiding over a financial crisis that would shape the Church's future in ways he could not have fully anticipated. The Vatican under Leo was, in many ways, the Church at its most glorious, not in piety perhaps, but in ambition, in the belief that human creativity in service of faith could achieve something approaching the divine. But it was also the Church beginning to consume itself from within, spending faster than it earned, borrowing against a future it could not foresee, all in the service of building monuments that would stand as silent witnesses to both the Church's greatest aspirations and its most consequential mistakes. And the genius who worked within those walls, Raphael with his orderly brilliance, Michelangelo with his tormented fire, neither of them could have known that their masterpieces would ultimately stand against a backdrop of financial desperation, of spiritual compromise, of the very crisis that their own brilliant work had helped to create. Now, as we walk deeper into the machinery of the Medici papacy, it becomes necessary to understand a particular practice that would ultimately shake the very foundations of the Church itself. Though, on the surface, it appeared merely as an elegant solution to an ancient problem. The sale of indulgences, those documents promising remission of sin or time in purgatory, had existed for centuries, but under Leo X and the financial architects of his reign, it became something far more systematic, far more calculated, and far more directly tied to the methods of Florentine banking than perhaps anyone had realized before. Picture, if you will, a problem that had troubled the Church for generations. The construction of St. Peter's Basilica, that magnificent dome still rising above Rome, required an almost incomprehensible amount of wealth, marble, labor, the brilliance of architects like Donato Bramante and later Raphael himself. All of it demanded coin, endless streams of coin. The Vatican's treasury, despite centuries of tithes and donations, remained perpetually strained. And so the Church had long turned to a spiritual instrument that could generate revenue, the promise that payment, combined with sincere repentance, could shorten one's suffering in the afterlife. It was, in essence, a celestial transaction. A soul could be lightened of its burden through a monetary exchange. Under previous pontiffs, this practice had remained somewhat diffuse, managed by local bishops and clergy, with varying degrees of vigor and consistency. But when Leo X ascended to the throne, he brought with him not merely the authority of the papacy, but the sharp financial sensibilities of the Medici Bank. The indulgence scheme, which might have continued as a loose and haphazard affair, was suddenly reformed along lines that would have been immediately recognizable to any Florentine merchant. Clear pricing structures, assigned quotas by region, detailed accounting of revenue, and a professional infrastructure to collect and audit the money flowing back to Rome. Consider what this transformation truly meant. In Florence, the Medici Bank had pioneered the use of branch networks, standardized record-keeping, and what we might recognize now as early forms of cost accounting. Letters of credit moved money across vast distances. Double-entry bookkeeping meant that every transaction existed in two places simultaneously, allowing scrutiny and verification. These were revolutionary tools, and they had made the Medici fortune. Now, in the early 16th century, some of these very same principles, refined through decades of handling the finances of kingdoms and popes, were being applied to the salvation of human souls. The indulgent sellers, known as quaestores, became something resembling commissioned merchants with assigned territories. A quaestor arriving in a German city or a Polish town would come armed not only with bulls of authorization, but with marketing materials that spoke to local concerns and aspirations. The poor might be offered the promise of indulgences for themselves or their deceased relatives. The wealthy might purchase them for grand intentions, the sponsorship of churches, the preservation of their families standing before God. The pricing, while theoretically flexible and subject to confession and sincere repentance, followed patterns that were remarkably standardized, almost as if one were consulting a merchant's price list. A document granting remission of sins might cost one price in Venice, a slightly different sum in Augsburg, scaled to what the market could bear, to what local wealth would support. Now, does this sound like cynicism or simple banking? Perhaps both, and perhaps neither. The people who designed and executed this system, and we must remember that Leo X himself was not a deeply spiritual man, though he was a cultivated one, likely believed in the theological legitimacy of what they were doing. The Church had long taught that indulgences worked. The sale of them was an established practice. Why not make it more efficient? Why not apply the lessons of double-entry bookkeeping to the management of grace? Yet there was something troubling in this marriage of banking and salvation. For the first time, the mechanisms of commercial exchange had been so directly, so visibly, so systematically applied to the most intimate transaction between a human soul and God. Money, which had once been an incidental accompaniment to indulgence, given in good faith, documented loosely, was now central to the entire operation. The machines of banking that had enriched the Medici were now being turned toward the spiritual marketplace itself. It was as if the very ledgers that had tracked silk futures and foreign exchange now began to track the debts owed to divine mercy. The effects rippled outward in ways that the architects of the system might not have fully anticipated. In Germany, where the sale of indulgences was pursued with particular vigor, largely to fund construction projects in Rome, far from the eyes of those paying, a growing unease began to settle among the faithful. Priests and preachers who believed themselves to be servants of God's truth found themselves in an uncomfortable position. They were being asked to sell something that, however theologically sound it might have been in theory, began to feel in practice like a transaction, a bargain, almost a fraud. The nobility who funded the operation began to whisper questions. The common people, already resentful of church wealth and clerical pretension, found in indulgences a symbol of everything they suspected about the corruption of Rome. What makes this moment particularly worth our reflection, as we contemplate it here in the darkness, is how it reveals something fundamental about the relationship between commerce and faith. The Medici had not invented this corruption, if we can call it that. The Church had been selling indulgences long before Leo X's papacy, but they had, in a sense, industrialized it. They had taken an existing practice and optimized it along the lines that had made their bank wealthy. They had applied the tools of commerce to the deepest questions of human spirituality, and in doing so, they had made visible something that had previously been easier to ignore, that underneath the robes and the incense and the theology, there was a transaction occurring. There was money changing hands. It is a meditation that carries weight even now, as we lie in the stillness of the night. How does the machinery of commerce alter the things it touches? When we apply the logic of markets to the sacred, do we elevate commerce or diminish the sacred? The Medici probably never asked themselves these questions. They were bankers doing what bankers do, optimizing, systematizing, making things more efficient. But somewhere in the German countryside, in a monastery or a cathedral, a monk was beginning to wonder if the Pope had become not a spiritual father, but a merchant, and whether Christ had ever intended that. As the 16th century drew forward, there moved across the forests and university towns of northern Europe a current of unease that Rome did not yet recognize as dangerous. In a place called Wittenberg, in the Saxon territories where winter came early and held long, a monk and scholar named Martin Luther had begun to turn questions over in his mind, like a man turning stones to examine what lay beneath them. These were not new questions, mind you. Others had asked them before, in whispers, in margins of manuscripts, in the quiet of their cells. But something in the particular moment, the particular confluence of printing presses and growing literacy, and the particular weight of church finance pressing down on ordinary people, had made these questions impossible to ignore. Picture, if you will, the rhythm of daily life in those northern territories. A peasant or a merchant might live their entire span knowing that their parish priest held keys to salvation itself, or so they were taught, and that priest answered to a bishop, and that bishop to an archbishop, and all of these men existed within a vast hierarchy that climbed, rung by rung, toward Rome, where Peter's successor sat amid marble and gold. But the costs of maintaining that Rome, that marble, that gold, those increasingly elaborate ceremonies, those costs did not simply evaporate. They flowed outward, downward, like water seeking the lowest ground. And in the early decades of that century, as the Medici popes undertook their grand patronage of artists and architects, as they commissioned Raphael and Michelangelo to paint and sculpt the church into a monument of human genius, the weight of those expenses had become peculiarly visible. It was, in many ways, a distant thunder at first. Luther's early writings circulated slowly through Europe. There was no news cycle, no rapid dissemination of ideas across continents. A pamphlet might take weeks to reach beyond a few hundred readers. A sermon might be remembered and retold, distorted in the retelling, softened or sharpened depending on the tongue that carried it. And yet something in his protest seemed to resonate with a kind of inevitability. He spoke against the selling of indulgences, those documents that promised the forgiveness of sins, or more precisely, the remission of temporal punishment in purgatory. To modern ears, it might seem a peculiar grievance, but to a person of faith who had been told that they could purchase their dead mother's swift passage to heaven or their own salvation secured, the practice would have felt like something between a tax and an extortion. And here was a monk saying what others had perhaps thought, but not dared to speak aloud, that no priest, no pope, no treasure could grant what belonged only to God's grace. Rome, in those first years, did not take him particularly seriously. The church had weathered critics before. There had been reformers and mystics and visionaries who had challenged aspects of church practice, and the institution had endured. The Pope, by this time not Leo X but his successor Clement VII, also a Medici, also surrounded by the considerations of art, finance and political power, may not have immediately grasped how different this moment was. Or perhaps they did sense something in the character of the challenge, something in the way printing presses could multiply Luther's words across territories faster than messengers could travel. But one can imagine the Vatican, in those early years of the 1520s, as a place still largely absorbed in its own elaborate concerns. The Medici still held the throne. The greatest artists in Christendom were still creating wonders within those walls. The sound of construction and restoration echoed through courtyards where cardinals debated theology and politics in equal measure. Yet the murmur grew. It is difficult now, centuries distant, to reconstruct exactly how information moved, how quickly it moved, how distorted it became in transit. But gradually, across regions where literacy was rising, where merchants and craftspeople could read, where printing had become established, the core of Luther's argument began to spread like ink diffusing through water. He had, in his way, articulated something that had been building pressure beneath the surface of Christian Europe for some time. The complaint was not merely theological, it was also fundamentally economic. It was the complaint of people who felt that Rome was distant, that Rome was greedy, that Rome seemed to care more for its own magnificence than for the souls it claimed to shepherd. A Medici Bank had financed much of that magnificence. The very innovations in accounting and finance that had made the Medici family rich had also been applied to the church's own fundraising, creating increasingly sophisticated mechanisms to extract coins from the faithful. One might wonder, in the quiet of the night, whether anyone in Rome consciously made the connection. Did the cardinals ever sit together and ask, could our own methods of finance, our own dependence on revenue from forgiveness, our own magnificent buildings and elaborate ceremonies, have created the very conditions that make us vulnerable to this monk's protest? It is perhaps the nature of institutions to be least capable of seeing the contradictions that their critics see most clearly. The Medici popes had come to power through the careful management of wealth and influence. They had used money to secure allies, to commission beauty, to project power, and now money itself, or rather the Church's hunger for it, had become a focal point of critique. In the German territories and beyond, the thunder continued to roll. Luther, contrary to what one might have expected, was not silenced or imprisoned. Instead, he was protected by powerful German princes who had their own reasons for resenting Rome's financial claims. A duke or an elector might look at the flow of church money leaving his territory and see in Luther's protest not merely spiritual rebellion, but also an opportunity for political and economic independence. The complexity of the moment, then, was far greater than the simple image of a monk against the Pope might suggest. There were princes and powers and economic interests, all converging in a way that made the protest something more than a heresy to be condemned and forgotten. And in Rome, during these years, one can almost imagine a certain kind of fatigue settling in. The Medici popes, brilliant as they were in many respects, were also men of the world. They understood power, money, art, politics. But the particular moment they inhabited was not one that required their particular kind of genius. It required, perhaps, something else. The ability to hear a critique and to genuinely reckon with it. The willingness to consider that some of the mechanisms through which the Church raised money might themselves be the problem. And that kind of self-examination does not come easily to institutions or to men, especially when those men have risen to the highest positions through their mastery of existing systems. The gathering storm was not yet a storm, not yet. It was still, in the 1520s, a phenomenon that could be observed from a distance, discussed, perhaps even misunderstood. But it was moving, it was gathering force. And though Rome did not know it yet, the world that had made the Medici rise to such heights was beginning to shift beneath their feet, in ways that neither their banks nor their patronage, nor their very considerable intelligence would be able to fully arrest. The elevation of Giulio de Medici to the papal throne in the year 1523, taking the name Clement VII, marked a turning point not yet understood by those who witnessed it. Here was a man born not into destiny, but into calculation, the illegitimate son of Giuliano de Medici, raised in the shadow of legitimacy, yet schooled in the very disciplines that had made his family indispensable to Christendom. Where his cousin Leo had worn the tiara, with something approaching theatrical pleasure, Clement arrived at the throne, bearing the weight of an entirely different era. By the time Giulio knelt before the cardinals who would elect him, the world had begun to fracture in ways that no amount of Medici gold could easily repair. Martin Luther's protest had ripened from a theological dispute into something far more dangerous, a great schism tearing at the fabric of Christian unity. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, had grown restless under papal authority. France and Spain circled Rome like wolves testing the defences of a wounded prey. And beneath it all, the Church's finances, so carefully managed and so liberally spent on the splendours of the Vatican, had begun to strain under their own weight. Clement, unlike Leo, seemed to understand the precariousness of his position from the very moment he assumed it. Contemporary chroniclers noted that his countenance bore a certain gravity, a thoughtfulness that suggested he recognized the burden he was taking on. He had spent decades as a cardinal, watching the machinery of the Church operate, understanding its debts and dependencies in ways that perhaps even Leo had never fully grasped. The banking knowledge that flowed through Medici veins was perhaps never more needed than in those years of mounting crisis. Yet here lay a profound contradiction that would define his papacy. Clement was a man formed by the very practices that were now coming under withering scrutiny. The sale of indulgences, that elaborate financial instrument through which the Church absolved sins for coin, had funded much of the Vatican's grandeur and sustained the Medici's position as the Church's bankers. But it was precisely this practice that had ignited Luther's fury. As Clement sat in the papal chambers, surrounded by the Raphaels and Michelangelos purchased with that same controversial revenue, he occupied an impossible space, the heir to a system now openly challenged across half of Europe. One might pause and consider what it must have felt like to be Clement in those early years of his papacy, a man educated in mathematics and commerce, trained to see the world through ledgers and accounts, now required to navigate theological waters increasingly turbulent with doctrinal dispute. The cardinals who had elected him had done so partly because he was a Medici, because the Medici had proven they could manage money and power with a kind of steady competence that transcended their origins, but they had elected him into a maelstrom. The Emperor Charles was the first to test the new pope's resolve. Charles, that great Habsburg monarch who ruled vast territories across Europe and the New World, had his own designs on church authority and papal independence. He made demands. He maneuvered. He positioned his military forces as both threat and protection, creating a dangerous ambiguity around what the Pope could actually control. Clement found himself caught between the need to assert papal authority and the practical reality that his authority depended entirely on forces beyond his command. Italy itself was becoming a battlefield for larger powers. The French and Spanish competed for dominance in the peninsula. Milan and Naples were contested prizes. Florence, the Medici's home, became caught in these struggles as well. Clement's position was thus doubled. He was not merely the Pope, bound by spiritual and temporal responsibilities to Christianity, but also the head of a banking family with interests and properties scattered across Italy and beyond. When armies moved, they threatened both the Church and the Medici patrimony. When diplomacy failed, both suffered. The financial situation worsened as the years of Clement's papacy accumulated. The war against Lutheran reform was not merely spiritual, it required resources. military campaigns, diplomatic missions, the maintenance of the papal court itself, with all its artistic patronage and bureaucratic apparatus, these things cost extraordinary sums. And yet the very revenue streams that had filled papal coffers were now compromised. Regions that had fallen under Protestant influence no longer sent their indulgence payments to Rome. The Church's financial structure, so carefully constructed, began to crumble at the edges. Some historians suggest that Clement understood this crisis with particular clarity precisely because he came from banking, where a pope of purely ecclesiastical background might have relied on piety or doctrine to navigate the troubled waters. Clement knew intimately the mathematics of insolvency. He had grown up watching his family manage the complex finances of great institutions. He understood compound interest, default risk, the perilous consequences of spending beyond one's means. Yet this knowledge, however sophisticated, could not solve the fundamental problem that Rome now faced. The Church's debts were not merely a matter of accounting, but of legitimacy itself, and that, perhaps, no Medici could truly remedy. Throughout his early years as Pope, Clement attempted various remedies, each reflecting his background. He tried to reduce Vatican spending, though this proved deeply unpopular among the cardinals and courtiers accustomed to lavish conditions. He attempted to negotiate with Charles and the other powerful monarchs of Europe, using the diplomatic skills that had been honed within Medici councils for generations. He even, at times, attempted to reach some accommodation with the reformers, though the divide had grown too wide for any compromise to hold. What emerges from historical records is a portrait of a man genuinely troubled by the position in which he found himself. Clement was not reckless like Leo. He was not ambitious in the theatrical sense. He appears instead as someone who recognized, perhaps with a clarity that was almost tortuous, the extent to which the foundations upon which the Church had been built were now compromised. The Medici had risen to prominence through financial innovation and careful management. But could those skills address a crisis that was fundamentally one of faith and authority? The letters and documents that survive from Clement's papacy reveal a mind working constantly, writing late into the night, consulting with advisors, weighing options that were all equally unsatisfactory. This was the burden he carried as he moved through the corridors of the Vatican, past the great works of art that symbolized both the Church's cultural glory and its spiritual ambition. He was a banker, trying to manage an institution that had transcended mere finance. He was a Medici, trying to preserve a position of power that was increasingly unstable. And he was a pope, trying to hold together a church that was tearing itself apart. The contradictions of his position would only intensify in the years to come, but in these early moments of his papacy, we glimpse a man aware that the age he inherited was already passing, that the world Leo X had navigated with such apparent ease had shifted fundamentally on its axis, and that all the gold in the Medici vaults could not purchase the kind of stability and unity that would be required to guide Christendom through the transformation that lay ahead. In the spring of that year, the year 1527, something shifted in the Roman air. The city that had stood as the center of Christendom for more than 1,000 years found itself suddenly vulnerable, and in the debris of that vulnerability, Pope Clement VII, born Giulio de Medici, nephew of Leo, would face the gravest test of his papacy, a test that would reshape not just his rule, but the relationship between the Church and the very concept of earthly power itself. The armies came not as a religious schism, but as a consequence of war. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, locked in his endless struggle with the French King Francis for dominion over Italian lands, had sent mercenaries south, German landsknechts, Spanish soldiers, Italian condottieri, all unpaid, all hungry, all moving toward Rome with the momentum of a storm that could not be recalled. It is perhaps difficult, in this moment before sleep, to fully comprehend the violence that unfolded when those armies breached the walls of Rome on the 6th of May. The historical record speaks of carnage, of churches desecrated, of treasures stripped and scattered, of a city transformed overnight from the seat of spiritual authority into a place of chaos and despair. But rather than dwell in that immediate horror, a territory where our ears grow rigid and sleep retreats, we might instead pause in the aftermath, in those long, heavy days that followed, when Clement himself was imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo, when Rome lay broken and stunned, and when the full weight of consequence began slowly to settle. What is remarkable, what deserves our slow consideration, is not the violence itself, but what it revealed. For months, Clement remained essentially a prisoner in his own city. The Medici Pope, whose family had accumulated such extraordinary influence through banks and bonds, through careful placement of relatives in cardinals' robes, and through generations of diplomatic calculation, discovered that none of these financial instruments could purchase him back his freedom. The irony is quiet but profound. Here was a man whose entire life had been built on the principle that wealth was power, that the right sum of money could unlock any door, turn any key, bend any will. And yet, in the rubble of Rome, surrounded by unpaid soldiers who would obey no one because they had been promised nothing they could not take by force, his enormous resources became nearly meaningless. The city itself underwent a strange transformation during those months of occupation and aftermath. Ransomed populations crept back into the streets. Families emerged from hiding to find their homes emptied, their chapels violated, their sense of the sacred order fundamentally shaken. And yet, and here is where a deeper pattern emerges, Rome did not remain broken. The human impulse toward recovery, toward restoration, began almost immediately. This is something history sometimes glosses over in its haste to move toward the next crisis. There is a quiet dignity in the way a city, once violated, slowly rights itself. The cleaning of streets, the repairing of doors, the carefully patient work of priests who, even as they grieved, began once more to tend to altars and prepare the liturgy. For Clement himself, the sack became a kind of involuntary meditation on power and its limits. He was released eventually through negotiation and ransom, but something in him had fundamentally shifted. A pope who had entered office surrounded by the symbols of dynastic prestige now found himself walking through streets where that prestige had been stripped away, where the magnificent facade of church authority had been revealed as dependent on very mortal and very fragile military protection. Consider what this meant for a Medici. The family had always understood that money could accomplish what force could not, that you need not waste resources on conquest if you could instead fund the right cardinals, secure the right alliances, place yourself in the positions where history's winds would naturally blow in your favor. The sack of Rome, in a sense, revealed the flaw in this philosophy. There remained, in the world, forces that did not respond to ledgers and coin. There remained soldiers who, when unpaid and undisciplined, would behave as soldiers always have, indifferent to the theological significance of what they destroyed. As the months moved forward and Rome gradually restored itself, as Clement emerged from his imprisonment and resumed his papal duties, the city entered a peculiar phase. There was neither the grandeur that had preceded the sack, nor the chaos that had defined it. Instead, there was something more uncertain, more fragile. The prestige of the papacy itself had been visibly damaged. For those who had always believed that the Church's temporal power was justified by divine protection, here was evidence that no such protection had been forthcoming. Soldiers had defecated on altars, reliquaries had been opened and their contents scattered or destroyed. Sacred vessels had been melted down for their metal. The line between the sacred and the profane, which the Church had worked so carefully to maintain, had been violently erased. One might wonder, in the stillness of contemplating this moment, what thoughts occupied Clement as he walked through these ruined streets. Did he feel the weight of responsibility for the financial policies that had contributed to the wars that brought those armies south? The Medici had indeed benefited enormously from their role as bankers to the church, from the fees they extracted for managing papal finances, from the privileges granted to their family members, but they had also, whether by design or consequence, become entangled in the church's temporal ambitions, its wars, its alliances, its desperate need to maintain and expand its earthly territories. The sack of Rome was, among other things, a kind of reckoning with that entanglement. In the years that followed, Rome would be rebuilt. Clement would commission artists to repair what had been destroyed. The grand basilicas would be restored. The machinery of the church would resume its functions. But something essential had shifted. The absolute confidence in the permanence of ecclesiastical authority had been shaken, and within a few years, the first tremors of the Protestant Reformation would begin to break the medieval unity of Christendom. It is impossible to say with certainty that the sack of Rome directly caused the acceleration of religious schism in Northern Europe, yet one cannot help but observe that the spectacle of Rome violated, of the Pope imprisoned in his own fortress, of the Church revealed as vulnerable to the same historical forces that threatened any kingdom or state. This spectacle would have circulated through Christendom, whispered in taverns and discussed in the halls of princes. It may have contributed, however subtly, to a growing sense that the old order, the medieval synthesis of religious and temporal authority, was no longer stable, no longer inevitable. And so the sack of Rome becomes not merely a moment of violence, but a turning point in how the world understood the Church itself. In the quiet aftermath, in the slow work of restoration, in the changed demeanor of Clement as he moved through the ruins of his authority, we see the beginning of the Church's long withdrawal from its position as the dominant temporal power in Christendom. The Medici had risen by understanding how to accumulate and deploy influence. In that terrible spring of 1527, they learned, along with Rome itself, the limits of what accumulated influence could protect against. While Rome itself remained the heart of Medici ecclesiastical ambition, the family's influence was not content to remain bound by Italian walls. A quieter, less visible current of power was flowing northward across the Alps, carried in the careful preparation of a young woman whose life would become a bridge between two kingdoms. Catherine de Medici, born in 1519, was the daughter of Lorenzo de Medici, Duke of Urbino, a man whose own life had been marked by loss and longing, and whose daughter would inherit both his cunning and his drive to elevate the family name beyond the boundaries of Tuscany. When Catherine was still a girl, her father died, and her mother followed not long after. She was left in the care of the church, educated in convents where she learned languages, statecraft, and the invisible architecture of power. She learned to read Latin and Italian, to understand the rhythms of diplomacy and the weight of dynasty, and while her cousins in Rome were ascending toward the papal throne itself, Catherine's own fate was being woven into a far more distant tapestry. She had been promised, from her earliest childhood, to Henry, the son of the King of France. It was a marriage arranged not for love, but for something deeper and more enduring, for the projection of Medici influence beyond Italy, into the very court of Europe's most powerful Christian monarch. In 1533, when Catherine was 14 years old, she made the journey from Italy to France. Imagine, if you can, the slowness of that crossing. The roads would have been uncertain, the weather unpredictable, the passage through the Alps a trial of cold and endurance. She travelled with a retinue befitting her station, carrying with her the hopes of her family and the inheritance of Medici wealth and knowledge. Some accounts suggest the journey took nearly 2 months. Each day brought her farther from Florence, farther from the cathedral bells and the Arno, and closer to a new world where she would have to construct her influence from nothing but her intellect, her courage, and the quiet power of financial knowledge that ran through her blood. The marriage itself was a calculated union. Henry of France was then a young man, perhaps less inclined toward diplomacy than toward the pleasures of youth. But Catherine had been trained since childhood in the art of patience. She bore him children, 10 of them, over the course of many years. She positioned herself not as a passionate consort seeking the spotlight, but as a woman of careful observation, of networks and subtle influence. She learned French, she understood French nobility, and she began the slow work of placing Medici interests within the French court. What made Catherine's position so remarkable was that she did not simply sit in the gilded chambers of Fontainebleau and wait for power to come to her. Instead, she constructed networks. She became intimate with the details of the royal household. She cultivated relationships with the wives of powerful nobles, with the confessors and advisors who whispered counsel into the ears of kings. She studied the art of financial influence that her uncles and cousins had perfected in Florence and Rome, but she adapted it to the French context. She understood, perhaps better than any of her male relatives, that power operates not always through direct assertion, but through the careful manipulation of information, the strategic placement of trusted allies, and the slow accumulation of obligation and debt. When King Francis I died, in 1547, Henry ascended to the throne. Catherine's position shifted immediately. She was now not merely a duchess, but the Queen of France, and in that elevation, Medici influence moved into the very heart of European political power. The family that had risen from banking in Florence had now placed one of its own at the table, where the fate of nations was decided. But what was remarkable about Catherine's influence was how she wielded the financial knowledge of her family. She did not rule through military force, nor did she seek the flashy prominence that marked some of her relatives. Instead, she became known for her understanding of patronage, of how wealth could be translated into loyalty. She gathered around her a court of artists, philosophers, and dreamers. She understood, in a way that perhaps even her banker ancestors had not fully grasped, that money and beauty, finance and art, were not separate domains, but intertwined expressions of the same underlying truth, that those who control resources shape not only material reality, but the very way that people think and feel. The influence of the Medici in France was never as direct or as visible as it had been in Florence or Rome. Catherine did not hold absolute power, nor could she have wished to. Instead, she worked through the complicated machinery of French nobility, through alliance and marriage, through the careful distribution of favor and the strategic withdrawal of support. She placed her own children into positions of power. Her son Francis became King of France. Her son Charles became King of France. Her son Henry became King of France. Through her children, the Medici bloodline was woven into the very succession of French monarchy. One might pause here and wonder at the nature of such influence. It was not the direct power of a pope sitting in the Vatican, nor the visible dominion of a duke ruling Florence from the Palazzo della Signoria. It was something more subtle and perhaps, in its own way, more profound. It was the power that comes from understanding human nature, from knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, from recognizing that wealth is only useful if it is connected to the deeper structures of power and belief. Catherine lived to the age of 69, long enough to see her influence extend across generations, long enough to shape not only the politics of France, but the very character of French nobility and culture. And all the while, the banking knowledge of the Medici, the careful ledger-keeping and financial innovation that had begun with Giovanni di Bicci de Medici in the early 1400s, continued to inform her strategies and those of her descendants. When we think of the Medici popes and their influence, we often focus on Rome, on the splendid chapels and the ambitious art commissions, on the audacious elevation of family members to the highest ecclesiastical offices. But Catherine reminds us that Medici influence was not a single beam of light focused on the Vatican. It was rather a diffuse illumination, spreading outward through marriage and diplomacy, through the careful placement of family members in positions of power across Europe. The Medici did not simply rule from Florence or Rome. They whispered into the ears of kings and queens. They shaped the marriages that united or divided kingdoms. They projected their vision of beauty, order, and power far beyond the borders of Italy. The departure of Catherine to France was thus not a loss of Medici influence, but a transformation of it, a translation of Italian banking genius into the language of French court politics. And in that translation, we see the true extent of the family's ambition and capability. They were not merely wealthy merchants or ambitious ecclesiastics. They were architects of power itself, understanding that influence flows through the networks of family and marriage, through the careful management of finances and the strategic patronage of culture and learning. They understood that a woman like Catherine, sent to France as a bride, could become more consequential to the family's interests than any pope sitting in Rome, because she could shape the future, could place Medici interests at the heart of an emerging nation, and could ensure that the family's name and methods would endure long after the last Medici cardinal had passed from the earth. By the middle years of the 16th century, the question that had once burned so brightly, could the Medici truly rule from inside the church itself, had begun to cool into something quieter, more diffuse. Leo X was long gone, his papacy already a memory etched into the frescoes and architecture he had commissioned. Clement VII lay in his tomb, and yet the family's fingers did not entirely release their hold on Rome's machinery. They simply learned to grip differently, more gently perhaps, as power itself was shifting beneath everyone's feet. The Medici no longer needed to place one of their own upon the papal throne to exercise influence. They had learned something far more subtle over generations of banking and court intrigue. The architecture of power does not require that you sit at its highest point. It requires only that you understand its currents, that you maintain the right friendships, that you can whisper in the ears of those who do sit at the height. Cardinals, after all, needed patrons. They needed families with wealth and connections spanning across Europe. The Medici had both, and those resources did not diminish simply because the Medici no longer wore the papal crown. Consider what happened in the decades following Clement's death. The family produced a steady stream of cardinals, men who moved through the corridors of the Vatican with the quiet authority of those born to power and trained in its subtle languages. These were not merely pious ecclesiastics who had happened to wear red hats. They were instruments of Medici interest, carefully placed and strategically deployed. Some were gifted with genuine theological minds. Others were perhaps more suited to the counting house than the confessional, but they all served the same essential function. They kept the family name present in the College of Cardinals. They kept Medici interests alive in the deliberations that shaped church policy. One cannot help but wonder, in the stillness of this history, whether the Medici ever truly believed in the transcendent mission of the church, or whether for them it had always been, at its deepest level, another investment. They had treated the papacy as they treated everything else, as a venture to be funded, a property to be improved, a means of extending their influence. But there is a peculiar honesty in that calculation, is there not? For in many ways, the church itself, by that era, operated not so differently. It had become an institution that required capital, that dispensed patronage, that rewarded loyalty with offices and honors. The Medici were perhaps simply more open about the mechanics than many others dared to be. By the early 17th century, the shape of Medici power in the church had solidified into something more stable, if less dramatic. The family held the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, a secular realm they ruled directly, and that itself became a kind of power base from which to exercise ecclesiastical influence. They could offer protection to the church, military support if needed, the security that came from controlling a well-run state. In exchange, they could expect favorable treatment in the College of Cardinals, support for their preferred candidates in papal elections, perhaps the occasional elevation of a family member to high office. There were cardinals bearing the Medici name who distinguished themselves in their own right, men who contributed to church governance and intellectual life beyond mere family interest. The line between genuine vocation and dynastic placement had always been blurred in the Renaissance, of course. A man could serve his family and his God simultaneously, without experiencing them as conflicting loyalties. Or perhaps he could convince himself that he did. The human capacity for the negotiation of conscience is endlessly flexible. Yet as the 17th century deepened and rolled forward, one could perceive, if you paid careful attention to the slow movement of institutional power, a gradual erosion of that Medici grip. The Counter-Reformation had rigidified the Church in certain ways, made it more centralized around papal authority, less amenable to the kind of informal family influence that had once been wielded so effectively. Rome itself, as a political entity, was becoming more focused on its own direct interests and less available to be shaped by external dynasties, no matter how wealthy or well-connected. The Medici had been brilliant at reading and exploiting the particular moment in which they lived, the interregnum between the collapse of feudal order and the rise of the modern nation-state. But moments pass, and the institutions around them inevitably shift. The cardinals continued to be appointed. The family name continued to appear in the roles of the Church's hierarchy. But there is a quality, a subtle thing that observers at the time may not have fully registered, of diminishment. Not a sudden departure, but a slow fading, like the light in a room at dusk. The Medici ceased to be the primary voice in the naming of popes. They ceased to be the power behind the throne in any real sense. They became, instead, one family among others with interests in the Church, still important, still respected, still capable of placing a son or nephew into high position, but no longer the architects of Rome's direction. What had changed? Partly it was the same thing that had changed for Florence itself. The world was becoming larger. Spain and France and England were consolidating power in ways that made a merchant family, however brilliant, seem provincial by comparison. The center of gravity in European affairs was shifting. Banks were evolving, commerce was moving, and the particular genius that had allowed the Medici to dominate their world in the 15th century had become less decisive. And yet, there remained something almost poignant in how stubbornly the family clung to what it had achieved. They did not fade overnight. They did not relinquish their positions in the Church eagerly. Instead, they held on, maintained their cardinals, kept their networks alive, accepted with grace the diminishment that was coming, not as a collapse, but as a slow, gentle transition into a different kind of legacy. Perhaps they understood, in ways that are difficult for us to perceive across the centuries, that the greatest power they had ever exercised was not that of direct rule, but of having shaped, even transformed, the very nature of how power itself could be understood and managed. The story of the later Medici in the Church is in many ways the story of any family watching its dominion gradually pass away. It is neither tragedy nor triumph, but something in between, a recognition that influence is never permanent, that even the cleverest strategies eventually become antiquated, that institutions evolve in ways that no single family can fully direct. The Medici popes had ended. The Medici cardinals persisted but gradually dimmed, and the family turned its considerable talents toward other pursuits, other legacies, other ways of leaving its mark upon the world. There exists, in the dusty archives of Florence, a ledger so ordinary in appearance that a visitor might pass it without notice. Its pages are yellowed now, the ink faded to sepia, the leather binding cracked with centuries. Yet this single book, and others like it, represents a quiet revolution that would reshape not merely how the Church kept its accounts, but how the institution itself understood its own power, its obligations, and its relationship to money itself. The innovation was called double-entry bookkeeping, a method so logical, so beautifully systematic, that once you understand it, you wonder how the world ever managed without it. And yet for centuries, the Roman Church had done precisely that. Before the Medici brought their mathematical discipline to Rome's finances, the Vatican's accounting was less a science and more a kind of organized chaos. A treasurer might record what came in and what went out, but the two columns existed as separate conversations. There was no conversation between them, no way to know, with absolute certainty, whether a payment had been made twice or forgotten entirely. No ledger that could whisper its secrets to a trained eye. It was a system that allowed for accidents, certainly, but also for deliberate obscurity. If you wished to hide something, a medieval ledger was your ally. It asked few questions. Giovanni de Bicci de Medici understood something profound about this vulnerability. He saw that a bank, and by extension, any institution managing large sums, could not survive on trust alone. Trust is beautiful, trust is noble, but trust does not balance accounts at the end of the quarter. Trust does not prevent theft. Trust does not explain why 500 florins entered on a Tuesday disappeared by Thursday without a trace. So the Medici Bank, under Giovanni's careful hand, and then under Cosimo's expanding reach, brought to Florence a method that had been developing slowly in Venetian and Genoese merchant houses, the art of the double entry. Every transaction recorded twice, once as a debit, once as a credit. Two columns that must always equal each other. If they did not, something was wrong, something had to be found and corrected. This sounds perhaps too dry to merit attention in the waning hours before sleep, and yet consider what this actually means. Consider the sheer power embedded in that simple rule. A ledger organized in this way becomes a kind of honest mirror. It reflects the truth, not because the keeper of the ledger is virtuous, but because the system itself enforces virtue. You cannot lie to a well-kept double-entry ledger, not for long. The numbers will reveal you. The columns will not reconcile. Your deception will eventually stand out like a bloodstain on silk. When the Medici became bankers to the Pope, they brought this relentless honesty with them to the Vatican itself. And for the first time, in the early years of the 16th century, the Church began to see itself as it truly was, an institution with revenues and expenses, assets and liabilities, precisely like any other business. The shock of this recognition was perhaps greater than anyone anticipated. It meant understanding, for instance, that the sale of papal indulgences was not merely a spiritual matter, a question of theology and ecclesiastical authority, but a financial instrument, a product with a cost and a selling price, a quota to be met, revenue to be maximized. This is where the story grows melancholy, where the mathematics begin to weigh on the spirit. When you organize church finances using the same tools you use to organize a silk merchant's inventory, you create a new kind of pressure. You create targets. You create the need to show growth, stability, consistent returns. The church had never needed to think in these terms before. It had lands, yes, and rents from those lands. It had tithes from the faithful. It had donations driven by piety and fear of purgatorial flames. But these were understood as blessings, as grace flowing downward from God. They were not understood as line items on a ledger that must grow year over year to satisfy creditors and investors. Yet here was Cosimo's successor, here was Lorenzo, and then Giovanni himself ascending to the papacy as Leo X, all of them trained in the language of ledgers, all of them able to read a balance sheet the way a priest reads scripture. And so the church began to be run, as the Medici ran all their enterprises, with an eye toward the bottom line. The great basilicas were beautiful, yes, but they were also expensive. Raphael and Michelangelo were geniuses, absolutely, but geniuses who required payment. The money had to come from somewhere, and the ledgers, those honest columns of black and red ink, showed exactly where the gaps were forming. There is something almost tragic in this, if you pause long enough to feel it. The church did not set out to corrupt itself through accounting practices. The Medici did not sit down thinking, let us introduce spreadsheets and thereby destroy spiritual integrity. No, they simply brought order where there had been chaos. They brought clarity where there had been shadow. They brought the rational tools of commerce to an institution that had, for 1,000 years, preferred mystery. The ledger is neutral. It has no moral character. It simply shows the truth. And the truth, in the early 1500s, was that keeping the church running was becoming very expensive indeed. The double entry system also created something else, something the medieval church had never quite possessed: accountability. When money moved through a Medici ledger, it could be traced, it could be questioned. A cardinal might ask, where did this revenue go? And receive a precise answer, backed by entries in 2 separate columns, both of which were signed and dated. This sounds like an improvement, and in many ways it was. But it also meant that the church, for the first time, had to justify its spending to people trained to think in terms of profit and loss. The Medici bankers were not mystics. They did not understand why the church might need to spend money on things that had no return on investment. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the church began to spend money only on things that could be justified to a banker's mind. What is remarkable, when you step back and look at this transformation across the span of decades, is how thoroughly the language of finance reshaped the language of faith. Words like investment and capital and yield began to creep into ecclesiastical discourse. A donation was no longer merely an act of piety, it was a transaction. A soul saved through indulgence was no longer merely saved, it was revenue realized. The ledger did not invent these corruptions, but it made them visible, quantifiable, systematic. It turned them from occasional abuses into standard operating procedure. And so we arrive at a strange paradox. The Medici brought to Rome the most honest and rigorous accounting methods the world had yet developed. Their ledgers were models of clarity and transparency, and yet these same ledgers, these instruments of truth, became the architects of a kind of structural dishonesty. Because once you can measure spirituality in florins, once you can record grace on a balance sheet, you have already lost something essential. You have transformed the invisible into the visible, and in doing so, you have diminished it. This transformation happened not through dramatic declarations or shocking revelations, but through the patient accumulation of entries in ledgers that grew thicker year by year. No one noticed exactly when it happened. No one marked the moment when the church stopped being primarily a spiritual institution and became, in its operations, primarily a financial one. But the Medici ledgers recorded every step of the journey. They show us, if we know how to read them, the exact arithmetic of a slow, quiet compromise. The autumn of the Medici began not with a single betrayal or sudden loss, but rather as all true autumns do, with a slow, imperceptible turning of the season. By the middle of the 16th century, the family that had bent popes to their will and transformed Florence into the jewel of Renaissance Europe found themselves holding power that was becoming increasingly translucent, like light filtered through bare branches. The gold that had once guaranteed their supremacy was still there, yes, but the mechanisms through which it commanded obedience had begun to rust and weaken. Consider, for a moment, the peculiar vulnerability of a dynasty built primarily on wealth rather than hereditary title or ancient bloodlines. The Medici had never ruled as kings, not formally. Their dominion rested always on a foundation of careful transaction, quiet persuasion, and the simple reality that everyone owed them money. But wealth, unlike the symbols of monarchy that endure across centuries, must be constantly renewed. It flows like water, seeking always the lowest point, and the Medici coffers, for all their legendary depth, were slowly beginning to empty in ways that no ledger could quite disguise. The political landscape of Italy itself was shifting beneath their feet. The great powers of Europe, Spain, France, the Holy Roman Empire, were becoming the true arbiters of power in the peninsula. Florence, for all its beauty and brilliance, was growing smaller by comparison, a brilliant jewel set into a crown worn by distant monarchs. The Medici could still influence what happened within their walls, still direct the affairs of their city with that subtle hand that had served them so well, but the larger currents of history were now determined elsewhere, in the courts of Madrid and Paris and Vienna. At the same time, the Church itself was undergoing a transformation that would have seemed unimaginable a century earlier. The Council of Trent, convened in response to Luther's challenge, began the work of reforming the very mechanisms through which the papacy had accumulated its power. Indulgences became more carefully regulated. Nepotism, while it never disappeared entirely, was at least subjected to scrutiny and restraint. The loose, almost luxurious approach to ecclesiastical finance that had characterized the era of Leo X, that golden age when a Medici could commission Raphael and Michelangelo while spending money the Church did not yet possess, was slowly being replaced by something more austere, more accountable. With each reform, with each new rule about who could hold office and how the Church's wealth must be administered, the pathways through which Medici influence flowed into Rome grew narrower. Still there, still real, but diminished. The family continued to produce cardinals and bishops. There were always rooms in the hierarchy, for Medici sons, for cousins, for well-placed relatives. But these positions no longer carried the weight they once had. They became roles within a system, rather than levers by which to move the system itself. And in Florence, a curious reversal was taking place. The Medici had always ruled most effectively from behind the scenes, through the subtle manipulation of republican institutions that they formally supported while quietly controlling from above. It was an elegant arrangement, one that had allowed them to maintain the fiction of democratic governance while exercising near absolute power. But as the 16th century progressed, the energy required to maintain this illusion became exhausting. The pretense grew threadbare. Why not simply take the title that everyone understood they already possessed? This calculation led to a decision that some historians have seen as both triumph and admission of defeat. The Medici, formerly the grey eminences of Florence, became its formal rulers. Duke, Grand Duke. The titles accumulated, the family claim crystallized into something official and open. And yet there was something melancholic about this victory. It was as though, in finally grasping for the overt symbols of power they had always disdained to need, the Medici were acknowledging that the old order, the age when subtle wealth could command kingdoms, was passing away. The first Grand Duke, Cosimo I, a different Cosimo, descended from a younger branch of the family, presided over a Florence that was undeniably less influential than it had been. The age of the Renaissance, insofar as one can point to such things, was aging into the Baroque. The forward momentum of ideas, of artistic innovation, of intellectual discovery that Florence had once directed was now dispersing, flowing toward other cities, other patrons, other dreams. The Medici continued to nurture beauty, to commission great works, to present themselves as champions of art and learning. And it was genuine, this love of beauty, that had never been cynical. Yet increasingly, it felt like devotion to memory, rather than engagement with the future. The Medici Bank itself, that foundation upon which all else had been built, was in a state of slow decline that was almost invisible to those who were living through it. The branch in Rome remained profitable. The branch in Florence continued to function, but the great cosmopolitan network of banking operations that had once made the family indispensable to commerce across Europe was fragmenting. Rivals had learned the techniques that the Medici had pioneered. The Fuggers of Augsburg, now dominated certain markets. Antwerp was rising as a financial centre. The world was becoming larger, more complex, less dependent on any single family's expertise or goodwill. Think of how a great tree in a forest begins to fail. Not suddenly, not through a single catastrophic event, but gradually, through years of small diminishments. A disease in the roots that goes unnoticed for a time. Fewer new shoots in the spring. The ring of new growth in each year's wood becoming slightly narrower. The tree is still standing, still impressive to the eye, but something essential has changed. The vitality is diminishing. The great Medici enterprise was experiencing something similar. And yet, what is remarkable? What speaks perhaps to the fundamental soundness of much of what the Medici had built, is that this decline was so gradual, so gentle even. There were no swift reverses, no dramatic expulsions, no sudden catastrophes. The family did not fall from power like Icarus tumbling from the sky. They descended like autumn leaves, settling softly through the currents of changing history, coming to rest in a new position that was still, for quite some time, one of considerable respect and influence. The Vatican, even as it withdrew from its most lavish practices, continued to employ Medici cardinals in important positions. Florence, even as it became a duchy within the larger tapestry of European politics, remained wealthy and cultured and significant. The names of Medici continued to carry weight in certain circles for centuries, but the age in which they had been the primary force, the family whose nod could alter the trajectory of history, that age was passing. The autumn was settling in, the great days were becoming memory, and yet in the cool, clear light of that autumn, there was a kind of beauty, a kind of peace, as though the earth itself was gently teaching that all seasons change, all powers wane, and what endures is not dominion, but what we have left behind, in stone and in paint, in institutions and ideas, in the very shape of the world we made, while we had the strength to make it. And yet, when we step back from the ledgers and the political machinations, from the rise and the reckoning that followed, we find ourselves standing before something far more enduring than any bank account or papal decree. The Medici left behind not merely a history of power, but a language written in marble, in pigment, in the architecture of light itself. It is this transformation, from the purely mercenary to the mysteriously permanent, that settles most gently into the mind as evening deepens. Walk through the Uffizi Gallery today, or kneel in the Cathedral of Florence, or stand before the Medici Chapel with its sculptures by Michelangelo, and you are surrounded by the residue of their wealth, transformed into something that outlasts empires. Giovanni de Bicci's careful accounting practices, Lorenzo's shrewd political maneuvers, Leo's ambitious commissions, all of it crystallized into art that still breathes. The David, that perfect marble embodiment of human potential, exists partly because a Medici banker had the foresight and the capital to dream that such things mattered. And they did. They do. There is perhaps an irony, though a gentle one, in recognizing that the family's most permanent legacy has nothing to do with the gold they accumulated or the votes they counted. The paintings by Botticelli, the frescoes by Filippo Lippi, the mathematical precision of Brunelleschi's dome, these works have outlasted the political systems that spawned them by centuries. The money is gone. The banking houses closed their doors long ago. The popes who wore Medici blood are now whispers in history books. But the art remains, speaking a language older than currency, deeper than political intrigue. Consider what happened in those moments when a Medici patron stood before an artist and asked, quite simply, to transform vision into permanence. In those quiet negotiations, something profound occurred. Power and beauty collided, and beauty won. Or perhaps they merged entirely, becoming inseparable. We cannot fully separate the Medici's ambition to control Florence from their genuine, and it appears genuinely felt, desire to make that control beautiful. Was it all calculation? Likely some of it was. And yet, does the motive ultimately matter when the result is the Sistine Chapel ceiling, or the frescoes in the Brancacci Chapel, or the harmonious proportions of the Church of San Lorenzo? The relationship between faith and patronage grew more complicated as the story unfolded, particularly in those Vatican years when Leo X wielded both banking authority and spiritual leadership. He sponsored the greatest artists of his time, yes, but he also presided over a church drowning in debt, a church whose financial practices would soon provoke a reformation that fractured Christendom itself. Can we say, then, that the art was worth the cost? The question hangs unanswered, as most profound questions do. There is a peculiar quality to standing in a Medici chapel and sensing this duality. The marble is cool beneath your palm. The frescoes gleam softly in the filtered light. You feel, perhaps, a certain peace in these spaces, and yet they were commissioned by people who were, by any fair accounting, ruthless. They murdered rivals, manipulated popes, amassed wealth through mechanisms that would bankrupt nations. The same hands that signed off on patronage also signed off on assassination. The same mind that could conceive of such beauty could also coldly calculate political advantage. Perhaps this tension is not a contradiction, but a reflection of something fundamental about human nature itself. We are capable of both cruelty and creation, of small pettiness and grand vision, often simultaneously. The Medici, in their complexity, are merely a more extreme version of this universal struggle. They had more money to spend on their inconsistencies, more power to embed their contradictions into the world, but the fundamental paradox remains recognizably human. What we are left with, then, is not a simple story of good or ill, but a much quieter and more mysterious inheritance. The Medici are present in Florence in ways that have nothing to do with political dominion. They exist in the proportions of buildings, in the colors that still glow on walls after 5 centuries, in the mathematical precision of arches and domes. They exist in the knowledge that organized human effort, guided by vision and funded by capital, can create objects of such beauty that they stop time itself. Even now, even centuries later, a visitor entering those spaces feels something shift. The noise of the modern world recedes. The chronological present becomes suddenly thin. There is also something to be said about how the Medici story, for all its political machinations and financial sophistication, ultimately returns us to something very old and very simple: the human desire to leave a mark, to say to the future, "I was here, and I mattered, and here is the proof." The Medici did this not through monuments of their own names, though they did plenty of that, but through supporting the visions of others. Michelangelo's vision survived because Medici gold made it possible. Raphael's genius could flourish because Medici patronage protected him and paid him. In this way, the bankers and popes became custodians of something far larger than themselves. Walk the streets of Florence in the quiet hours, as evening settles and the tourists have dispersed, and you move through a city that is still, in many ways, a Medici creation. The political power is ancient history now, but the proportions of the squares, the harmony of the buildings, the light that falls through certain windows, all of this is their legacy, translated into the permanent language of stone and space. It is as if they learned, eventually, that true power was not in the temporary dominion over people, or votes, or church finances, but in creating vessels so beautiful that people would return to them across centuries, seeking something they could not quite name. This might be the deepest secret the Medici story holds, that the quest for power eventually becomes a quest for permanence, and that permanence is most reliably achieved not through force or money or political manipulation, but through beauty. The machines of commerce rust and are forgotten. The hierarchies of power collapse and are reorganized. But a perfect work of art, once created, becomes a kind of time machine, connecting the hand that made it to every eye that sees it across the centuries. In the chapels and galleries and churches where Medici patronage left its most visible traces, people still weep, not from political conviction or religious obligation, but from something much more mysterious, the direct experience of beauty, the sense that human hands have created something that touches something sacred in the viewer. This happens quietly. It asks no permission. It requires no belief system. It simply is, persistent and gentle, a language that speaks when all the politics and the ambitions and the machinations have finally fallen away. And so we return now to those streets where we began, to Florence once more, but this time beneath the cloak of night. The Arno still flows beneath its bridges, patient and indifferent to the centuries that have passed along its banks, carrying with it the memory of the families who once believed their names would echo forever through the chambers of power. The cathedral dome, that impossible geometry of terracotta and mathematics, still rises above the city in the darkness, its pale stone catching what little light remains from the stars and the distant glow of the city below. If you were to walk those streets now, as we do in imagination, you would feel the cool stone beneath your feet, worn smooth by the footsteps of pilgrims and merchants and artists and popes who all passed this way before us. The story of the Medici has settled into history now, the way a stone settles to the bottom of still water, becoming part of the landscape itself, barely visible beneath the surface yet somehow always there. What we have traced across these quiet hours is not a tale of triumph lasting forever, but rather the arc of human ambition itself, how a family of bankers rose to touch the very crown of Christendom, how ledgers and coin and careful patronage could reshape the world, and how even the greatest of earthly powers must eventually yield to time. The irony, if one pauses to consider it, is both tender and profound. The Medici built so much that still surrounds us. The art remains, the architecture endures, the books were written, the churches stand, yet the family itself, that tight knot of ambition and intelligence and ruthlessness and occasionally genuine piety, has largely faded from the living consciousness of the world. We might wonder, as we walk these imagined Florentine streets, what Giovanni de Bicci would think if he could see his name now, encountered only in the margins of history books, in the careful footnotes of scholars who piece together the story of how his careful double-entry bookkeeping helped reshape not just commerce, but faith itself. The banks are gone. The families that competed with the Medici for supremacy in Florence have also largely vanished, leaving barely a trace. Yet the paintings commissioned by Medici wealth still hang in museums and chapels. The dome they helped inspire still crowns the cathedral. The ideas nurtured in their academies still flow through the bloodstream of Western thought. There is something quieting about this perspective, something that speaks to the nature of legacy itself. We labor, we build, we shape, we gather power and influence, and seek to leave our mark upon the world. And yet the mark, when viewed from a great distance and across centuries, becomes something altogether different from what we imagined while we were making it. The Medici sought political dominion. What remained was art. They sought to control the church's purse strings. What remained was the question of whether the church itself could survive the corruption that money brings. They sought immortality through their name. What remained was beauty, learning, the slow forward march of human understanding. Leo X is dust. Clement VII is dust. The bankers who calculated the profit and loss of kingdoms are dust. But the hands of Michelangelo still reach across the Sistine Chapel ceiling, painted with Medici money, yearning toward God. Raphael's Madonnas still gaze out with that peculiar combination of serenity and sorrow. The libraries that were filled with books collected by Medici patrons still exist, their pages still capable of changing minds and hearts. The Florence that they built and rebuilt and defended and shaped with their wealth, still welcomes pilgrims who come to stand where they stood, to see what they saw, to touch the stones they touched. As you move deeper into sleep now, into that gentle descent where the waking world grows distant and the boundaries between memory and dream begin to soften, you might carry with you this image: the misty streets of Florence at night, the Arno barely visible in the darkness, a few lights glowing in windows where people rest, unaware that they walk through one of the great monuments of human ambition and human art. The cathedral dome is invisible now in the darkness, but it is still there. The Medici chapels are closed for the night, but the frescoes remain. The city sleeps as it has slept for centuries, and tomorrow it will wake, as it always does, to greet another day in the long procession of history. The story we have followed is one of many stories, one thread in the vast tapestry that stretches from the medieval world into our own present moment. And yet, it is a story worth knowing, not because it teaches us how to seize power. The Medici's methods are too bound to their own particular moment to serve as a simple blueprint, but because it teaches us something more subtle and perhaps more true. It shows us how culture and art and learning are not the opposites of power and money and political calculation, but rather inextricably woven with them. It shows us that the pursuit of beauty and the pursuit of profit can walk hand in hand, sometimes ennobling each other, sometimes corrupting each other, but always in relationship. And it teaches us, perhaps most gently of all, that nothing lasts. Not the greatest family fortunes, not the most carefully laid plans, not the most absolute power. What lasts is what we create. What endures is what we build that serves something beyond ourselves. The Medici learned this, or at least their legacy teaches it to us, whether they intended it or not. They gathered the greatest artists of their age, not merely to display their wealth, though they certainly did that, but because they believed that beauty mattered, that learning mattered, that the elevation of the human spirit through art and philosophy was worth the expense and effort of a lifetime. And in that belief, whether it was motivated by genuine piety or shrewd calculation, or some mixture of both, they created something that transcends their own particular story. So now, as the night deepens around those silent streets, as the mist rises from the Arno and drifts through the piazzas, as the cathedral stands patient and eternal in the darkness, the Medici story settles into its proper place, not at the center of the world as they once believed, but woven into the fabric of everything that matters. The art we treasure, the books we read, the beauty we recognize, the monuments we return to year after year. They are gone, but what they touched remains. And in that remainder is a kind of immortality, quiet and unboastful, asking nothing of us except that we remember, that we learn, and that we value what has been given to us from the great hands of the past. The city rests now, the stones cool in the night air, the river flows on, indifferent and eternal. And you too can rest now, knowing that you have walked for a time through one of the great stories of human civilization, through the chambers of power and the gardens of beauty, through the ledgers that changed the world and the cathedrals that still reach toward heaven. The Medici have completed their journey. Their story is complete, and as sleep draws you deeper, you can let their world fade gently away, knowing that it will always be there, waiting in history, patient and unchanging, ready for the next curious mind that wishes to understand how money and art and faith and ambition all became woven together in the story of a family that once ruled and then passed into the eternal quietness of the past.